Hello, welcome to the Bitcoin Standard podcast. Our guest today is Aleks Svetski. Aleks is the author of the new book, The Bushido of Bitcoin, and previously he'd written the Uncommunist Manifesto. He's also produced the Bitcoin Times series of magazines, or collections of essays, I should say. He's also an entrepreneur who's currently building a unique Nostr client called Setlantis, and he's previously worked on the world's first Bitcoin-only savings app, Amber. And also, he worked on producing the Spirit of Satoshi, Bitcoin-centric LLM. And the last time we hosted him, we discussed that. But today, we're going to be talking about the Bushido of Bitcoin. Aleks, welcome.
Safe. It's been too long, man. How you doing?
I am very good. It has been indeed. It's been way too long. You're too far in the world for us to be meeting too close.
Wait, am I too far or are you too far?
No, I think I'm kind of in the center of the world. You're in the outskirts, the new world.
That's true. That's true. Do you know what? I will most likely next year be moving closer to you. I'll be in the center of the world as well. So there we go. We'll be nice and close.
Nice. So you're moving to Dubai?
Most likely. I'm looking at it now. So
nice. Yeah, we'll be close then. Could be good to see you.
Excellent.
All right. So tell us about your new book, The Bushido of Bitcoin. What is the Bushido of Bitcoin?
Yeah, well, let's start with the namesake. So the word Bushido, I guess a lot of people always ask me, what the hell does that mean? What is this word? It sounds Japanese, and what the hell does it have to do with Bitcoin? So if I had to sum it up, I would start with the premise of that word. The word means way of the warrior, and in Japan, it was the code of virtue that emerged from the warrior class, who were the samurai, right? They were essentially the class within the Japanese feudal hierarchy that established, they protected the land, but they also, much like the knights of Christendom, right? The knights of the West were the ones who basically enforced norms, laws, etc. And what they did, very similar also to the Christian West, was they established this code. So in the West, we kind of had chivalry, right? And it was a way of being or a way of behaving. So act with courage, justice, loyalty, love, compassion, etc. And the Japanese samurai came up with something similar. And it wasn't like a prescriptive, 10 commandments, this is how you must behave. But it was kind of an unwritten code that they lived by. So the premise, therefore, of the Bushido of Bitcoin is basically a question of, when Bitcoin wins, who must we become and how must we behave? Because it's not so clear to me that everyone all of a sudden becomes virtuous once they become really wealthy out of Bitcoin. We do have these sort of talking points around, Bitcoin fixes this and it lowers time preference and everything, but there's just as much, or if not more, evidence that people who get into Bitcoin, make a bunch of money, end up becoming degenerates and become more fiat than previously, right? And many of the early Bitcoiners are actually probably more like that. There's very, very few early Bitcoiners that made a bunch of money and maintained Bitcoin only or built characters of virtue, right? So the whole book is basically a discussion on, okay, when Bitcoin wins, who do we become? Do we become a new parasitic elite? Do we become a bunch of Lambo crypto bros? Or do we become men and women of virtue? And if we want to become the latter, what virtues must we aspire towards? And that's a big part of the discussion, is like, what is that code? What does it look like? And I make very clear, I've said this in a couple podcasts now, this isn't Svetski's 10 commandments. This is a look at the great cultures that preceded the great civilizations of Earth, and what were the behaviors that were embedded or instilled into those cultures. And funny enough, the same virtues pop up in feudal Japan, in the Christian West, in Rome, in Greece, in ancient Persia. Like the great civilizations all had the same kind of thread. So that was sort of like what led me through the book. And there's 6 big sections of the book which we can sort of run through here and there, but that's basically the big question that it asks. And if I had to kind of sum up this sentence, I would say it's like a playbook for the leaders of tomorrow, because fundamentally those who have the wealth those who have the economic means, end up creating social means as well, right? They become tomorrow's leaders. So how must we behave? Who must we become when we have the duty of leading the world? So that's the big question. That's what I grapple with in the book.
Yeah. Well, before we get into that, I wanted to pick your brain on this. I think you raised an interesting question, which is, a lot of Bitcoiners make a lot of money and then just become degenerate shitcoiners and spend the money on all kinds of high time preference things. And many of them even lose their Bitcoin. A lot of early Bitcoiners made a lot of money and then they lost it because they blew it on shitcoins. They gambled with it on trading, trying to make even more Bitcoin. A lot of them invested in all kinds of stupid things and lost a lot of money. There's a huge number of Bitcoiners who I would say early on got lucky. They got into Bitcoin, put in, if you got in 2012, 2013, you put in a few $1,000, which for many people was, gambling money, playing money they could have spent on a weekend in Vegas, but instead they said, I'm going to put some money into the Bitcoin. And it goes up very quickly in a year or two, and then you've got yourself a fortune. So I'm wondering, you've probably thought about this question a lot because it motivates your book. So I'm wondering, how do you see the breakdown in terms of people going down that path versus people realizing the kind of transformative potential that Bitcoin has to you, in the sense that if you just use Bitcoin for good and you fix yourself so that you're not desiring high time preference degenerate behavior, then you're able to save well, and then you're able to accumulate more and more Bitcoin, and then you can start thinking about long-term goals and start thinking about doing meaningful things with your life. So I guess the provocative question I have here, and I think this might piss off a lot of Bitcoiners, but that's what I'm here for, is this really, we like to talk a lot about Bitcoin fixes this, but is this really the culture of Bitcoiners who've made it, or is it just the culture of the Bitcoiners who are living, optimizing to make it by reducing their expenditure enormously, increasing their income, working hard, stay humble, stack sats? Is that really going to be the culture of are these Bitcoiners going to be the same when their Bitcoin portfolio does another 100x? Or is that just the thing that they do now while they're, having to eat crow at work from their boss and having to keep putting up with all that stuff? So they put on this stoic face, accept it, and
is it all
I'm not in it for the Lambos. I'm in it for the revolution, and I'm in it for the transformation. And so, you suck it up for 5-10 years and you keep stacking your sats. But then once your sats really pile up,
then you get your Lambo.
Then you get your Lambos, and then and then maybe you start shitcoining. Maybe you go and you introduce the new, Ethereum or whatever, and you start telling people how it changes the world. We've seen some of these maxis switch later on. I think in some cases, which I'm not going to name, sometimes it seems that it's so obvious that it seems like it's just OPSEC. People are trying to disappear from the Bitcoin world. I think you and I know a couple, or at least one for sure that comes to mind, but we're not going to name him now. But maybe it's real. Maybe you just have a lot of money and then you start thinking that you are better than everybody, and then you can't do no wrong. And since you picked this genius idea that made you very rich, then clearly all your other genius ideas are going to be very rich. So what do you think, having thought about this question more?
It's a tough question. Do you know what it reminds me of? The question about nature versus nurture, right? And which one is it? Right, like when you're a father, obviously, and you raising your kids. What is more important in your opinion? Is it nature or is it nurture? In fact, let's do this as a discussion. What do you think it is? Like when you're raising kids, what matters more?
Well, I mean, matters more is a difficult question to answer because you can't really specify what do we mean by more. I think both are enormously important. I think you can find examples where nature overcomes nurture. So people who are, you could say, good genetic stock, who have good intelligence, good values embedded in them, even though they grow up in some of the most horrific environments that would destroy 99.9% of the people that grow up there. But sometimes you get these diamonds in the rough who just, for whom nurture doesn't matter at all. and they're
They
just
shine through. Yeah.
yeah, their intelligence, their ability to delay gratification shines through, and they find a way out of their predicament. But on the other hand, there are some times when you see that nurture matters a lot. I mean, I think the way that I would see it, perhaps, I think the example of sports is a good is a good way of looking at it.
Yes. Yes.
So a lot of people, a lot of people have this idea that if you just work hard, you too can be Michael Jordan. And it's not true. There's no set of exercises that I could have done from the day that I was born that would have made me Michael Jordan. There's no way I would have become a professional basketball player. And that's not just the height, it's athletic ability. And, athletic coaches can go watch a bunch of 7-year-olds play a soccer game or a basketball game, and they can tell definitely for sure who is never going to make it as an athlete. You look at them, this guy definitely not going to be a pro, definitely not going to be lifting trophies for a living. And then there are some kids that have the potential to do it, but there's no such a thing as a kid who's destined to do it, to make it, right? So even no matter how talented you are, no matter how skilled you are, you're not going to be Michael Jordan unless you really, really, really work hard at it. Especially at this point, if you look at professional athletes, there was a time, in the 1970s and 80s, there were professional athletes who would drink a lot, who would party a lot, who wouldn't train. And there's many stories about people like that. And they'd make it to the top. George Best is a famous one in Manchester United. And he was one of the best players in the world. And he was an alcoholic. And up until, at 26, he retired because he just completely ruined himself. But before he retired, or at least up until a couple of years before that, he was still doing really well, even though he didn't take his training seriously and he was drinking heavily. Well, that's gone now. At that point, football was a much smaller sport. There wasn't that much. Professionalism in it, and so if you were really talented like Best, you could make it even if you're drinking, and you could outplay really hardworking players who didn't have the same kind of ability. Today, this doesn't work anymore. There are no players in the professional game that you and I have ever heard of that are not extremely dedicated. All the ones that are drinking and partying, all the ones that are not taking their job easily, they never made it past 20 in the professional game. Totally. And there's all these stories of really talented players. So, for instance, there's another Manchester United player called Ravel Morrison. Alex Ferguson, who managed Manchester United for 26 years, worked with some of the best players in the world. He said Ravel Morrison is the best player he's ever coached. Ravel Morrison didn't make it as a professional. He messed up, and he had a bunch of stints at a bunch of big clubs, failed everywhere, and I think he's probably retired at this point. So what I would say, the answer to that question would be, nature is hugely important, and it determines the range of outcomes. So it's very clear that I was never going to make it in professional sports. I may have, I could make it as a doctor. Maybe I could make it as an engineer, but it doesn't mean I will make it into those things. It means that if I work really hard, if I have the right nurture, the right values, if I'm able to develop properly, and if I'm able to focus on those things, then I can make it in that field. So I don't think you can discount one or the other, and it's difficult to prioritize them in terms of more, but both are extremely important. Although, I guess, I would say there are examples where you can overcome nurture, but it's very difficult to overcome nature. There's never you can't train enough to become Michael Jordan, no matter what happens.
Yep. So precisely what you just described then is the answer to my other question. Is, does Bitcoin fix people, or does it attract people who have the right ingredients? It's the same kind of thing. I don't know which one it is, and I don't think there is a conclusive answer. I think that it is fundamentally a mixture of both. I think you need to have the predisposition inside you. Your nature has to be that kind, which is, I want to do better, I want to excel, I want to do good things, I want to be a virtuous person, I want to move forward in life. I have a vision. I have something like that, right? So that has to exist. And then if you find Bitcoin, it gives you a framework within which that kind of behavior, that kind of nature, that kind of desire will succeed, right? Because if you are someone, so let's say you have that kind of predisposition, that kind of nature, and you're like, okay, look, I want to save. So you start saving and putting your money in the bank, you're going to get robbed, right? Because you're going to lose it on inflation, blah, 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 right? So I think the answer to your previous question is very much similar to the answer for nature versus nurture. It's neither one. It requires both. And also the analogy that you used for the sports people was interesting as well, because it made me think. You said the bar used to be lower for sports people in a nurture capacity, and now it's much higher. And maybe now it's like we lived in a world previously, if you think, back 70, 80, 100 years, where society had these virtues still embedded within it. Now society has kind of skewed itself into this degenerate, like everything around us is degenerate, everything around us is gambling. So now the bar is much higher in order for you. Maybe the bar is not higher, because that analogy doesn't make sense. It's much, to be a virtuous person is not very, like to differentiate from the madness is not very hard. But maybe the ability to separate yourself out of the really caustic environment of poor nurture is a lot harder now than it used to be, right? So there's some sort of similarity there. But anyway, that's my answer to your question. Is I think it's a mixture of both. I don't think Bitcoin can fix someone who is fundamentally a crooked person inside, and I think there are many of those fundamentally crooked people in the world. There's I don't think any amount of Austrian economics or Bitcoin or anything is going to fix them. They're fundamentally, when they get wealthy, the wealth is going to amplify the worst parts of them, in the same way as technology might amplify the worst parts of them, etc. So that's my working theory at this point.
The Bitcoin Standard podcast is brought to you by the Safehouse.com, my independent publisher and bookshop, selling the best Bitcoin books in high-quality cloth hardcovers built to last for generations. Most books these days are pretty fiat. They're flimsy and they fall apart quickly, and I did not want that for my books, so I set up the Safehouse especially to provide you with beautiful, long-lasting classic cloth hardcovers you can proudly pass down for generations. You can get copies of my 3 books, The Bitcoin Standard, The Fiat Standard, and Principles of Economics, and you can also get copies of Lynn Alden's Broken Money, Parker Lewis's Gradually Then Suddenly, and Matthew Lysiak's Fiat Food, to which I contributed a few chapters. We now offer bulk discounts so you can buy books for yourself and for the friends and family you'd like to learn about Bitcoin. Buy any 2 books for $50, any 5 books or more for $20 per book, and for more than 50 books, it's only $15 per book. Go to the Safehouse.com, the SAIF house.com, where you can get all of these books in high-quality cloth hardcovers, delivered worldwide, and get 10% off for paying with Bitcoin. The Bitcoin Standard podcast is brought to you by the Daylight Computer. I love to work early in the morning and late at night, or in the sun outdoors, but regular computer screens are terrible at these times, and they strain your eyes. For years, I've wanted a paper-like electronic screen on a simple computer I could use to write. I tried several models, but none were very good. Now, finally, Daylight have delivered a fantastic full-function tablet with a paper-like screen that's easy on your eyes and great for outdoor use. I've been using the Daylight computer to write my next book, and it is absolutely fantastic, and it has led me to invest in this company myself. Check out my interview with Anjan Kata in episode 249. Yeah, I will say though, I think the quality of the average Bitcoiner is going to improve over time. So there's a sense that as we expand, as the Bitcoin network grows and more normies join, we're going to be getting more of the lower intelligence, integrity. Maybe we'd like to think that it's the smartest people who get Bitcoin early, and probably there is some of that. I mean, it takes an enormous amount of brain power to be able to get Bitcoin early when there are very little resources explaining it. There is some of that, but I think early on, it was highly likely, if you got into Bitcoin, it was highly likely that you'd make a quick buck from it, because Bitcoin initially used to spike very fast and it would go up really quickly. So for instance, if you bought in 2012, it was at the end of 2012 was something like $10, $12 at the halving in 2012.
50% move is very different at $100 than it is at 100,000.
Yeah. So it went from $10 to $1,000 by November 2013. So it did 100x in a year between 2012 and 2013. And it had done the previous 100x in a similar sort of time frame. So it was quite possible for somebody who's just a degen gambler to get in, wait for 6 months, 1 year, make life-changing money, and get out. But now I think it's a lot harder. You need to hodl for significantly longer periods of time. So think about the 100x. When was the last time we were at 1,000? To go from 1,000 to 100,000. So from 10 to 1,000 took a year. From 1,000 to 100,000 took about 11 years. Yeah, from 2013 to 2014. So, from 2013 to 2024. So 11 years, yeah. So to make that sort of money, you need to have a low time preference. To make the big money in Bitcoin now, you need to suck it up and stay humble and stack sats and cut down on the Lambos, cut down on the conspicuous consumption, and stack as hard as you can so that you can make the money. And you can't really do it overnight. It's harder. So I think the selection mechanism is probably becoming a little bit more favorable to having a lower time preference, probably.
Yeah, I mean, where I think the avenue to get the Bitcoin just changes, right? So previously would have been getting it from a faucet or just buying it online or whatever the case is. Now it's like, okay, maybe I can ape into this shitcoin and then as a result sell out into Bitcoin so that I can go from 0 to 100 Bitcoin, right? So maybe the mechanism changes, but I think fundamentally what you're describing there is the fact that most people in the world, I think, have the right ingredients. People know me for being very critical. I wrote the Remnant essay, talked about how the masses don't matter, and most people are lemmings and stupid and all this sort of stuff. But even though I say all that sort of stuff, I recognize, very, very clearly that most people, you give them a good enough framework, like you provide a framework for excellence, most people will find their way to creating something, building something, producing something, having a family, and like doing that, right? If you give them a framework for degeneracy, it's very easy for them to get swayed in there. And this is, the essence of my prior sort of talk about like the masses don't matter. It's not that I'm hating on the masses or I think they're evil or anything like that. They're just easily swayed. You give them whatever framework and they will adapt to the framework, right? There is a small virtuous elite, for example, who can, despite the framework, despite the nurture you give them, they have the nature to break through that. So if you put a poor framework around them, which is the fiat framework we're living in, a couple of us will reject that framework and will live in accordance to what we find as our own virtuous compass, moral compass. The standard normie will not. But if we can usher in a new framework, and this is why in the book I kind of call Bitcoin a framework for excellence. That's in my mind, like you want to build a strong culture, a strong family, a strong civilization, whatever. It needs to be, the North Star needs to be excellence. The North Star cannot be equality, cannot be the average man, cannot be every man for himself or, redistribution of wealth or any of that sort of stuff. It must be excellence. That's the North Star. That doesn't mean everybody can be excellent, but it provides a framework in which those who can excel will excel, and even those who cannot can find their way up the mountain. The etymology of the word excellence means to climb a mountain. So coming back to your earlier point, yes, as Bitcoin matures, the capacity to degen will change, at least directly for Bitcoin. I think people will find other ways to be degenerates, but ultimately, I think most people have the good ingredients. Most people with the right nurture have enough of a nature to be, virtuous people. And that's what we want to create. We want to create more of that. And beyond just Bitcoin, we need, in my opinion, this is the thesis of the book, is we need a playbook or we need a code that people can align around. And I mean more than just, I'm going to go off on a little bit of a tangent, which is related to the book here, but there's, towards the end of the book, I talk about why I chose the word code of virtue, because when I first started writing the book, I called it a moral code, and I got rid of the word morality from the whole book. I went and Control F and deleted all that shit, because I think if you want morality, you should go, read the Bible or something like that, or read the Quran, or whatever your belief system is. Virtue is different to morality, and in fact, I believe virtue is upstream of morality. Jimmy Song and I had a debate about this, and for me, a virtue is an act. It's almost like a combination of principle and behavior. If you could kind of like unite those two concepts of a principle and behavior, and like conceptually think about a virtue as those two things, a virtue is something you can't lie about. Like I can sit here and moralize to you and say, if you don't believe in Jesus or this or that or Muhammad, you're evil, right? But I can't tell you, for example, you should be a vegan if I'm a big fat slob, right? Or if I'm weak or something like that. Like a virtue is almost like an action. So you can tell people who have the virtue, for example, of discipline, or the virtue of responsibility, excellence around their physical body. You can't lie about that. And for me, a virtue, like things like courage, right? It doesn't matter if you're Chinese, Hindu, Muslim, Christian, atheist, whatever, it doesn't matter. We all recognize courage. So a virtue is something that transcends beliefs. So for me, when I wrote the book, I was thinking in this kind of thing. It's like, how do we establish a code that isn't about religion, belief, all this sort of stuff? You can do what you want, but you and I can be of different creeds, different beliefs, but we can align around, okay, this virtue is good. To be responsible leads us in the right direction. To be courageous leads us in the right direction. To be dutiful, to be loyal, to be self-controlled, self-restraint. That's the 10th virtue. To be compassionate. This constellation of virtues will lead us in the right direction. That's kind of the premise there. I know I went on a tangent.
Yeah, no, that's good. But I just wanted to say, you were mentioning earlier that the example of, if the masses would just go along with whatever framework, and I think this is very true and very astute, because, and it doesn't necessarily have to carry this kind of elitist, condescending connotation to it, because I think compare it to the question of obesity. So among the dumbest ideas in modern nutrition science and modern medical science, and there are a lot of very dumb ideas. One of the very dumb ones is that people are fat because of genetics. And it's so dumb because you look at pictures of the same city 100 years ago, these same people's grandparents 100 years ago, there wasn't a single fat person in a picture. So you look at pictures of New York in 1925, there would have been maybe 1 out of 1,000 who's fat. I mean, there was a photo somebody showed of somebody who was a circus act, a fat guy who would go to the circus, and people would look at him because he was so fat. And he's, if you saw him in America today, he wouldn't think of himself as fat. He'd call himself big boned and tell you that it's not about his food, that it's about something glandular or hormonal or genetic or something like that. He's, above average, not average in America, but fairly common. There's probably 20-30% of the American population that is more obese than he is. So this used to be the extreme outlier. This used to be the circus act. This used to be, from the genetic profile, this was the fat genes at their extreme allowed for 1 out of maybe 1,000 people to be this obese. Well, today it allows for 30% of the population to be, or 20% maybe. So clearly, we haven't had a world in which we've eugenically or dysgenically, if you want, bred the fat people excessively over the last 100 years and neutered all the fit people in order to arrive at a world in which the genes have switched so much. We haven't had fat breeding programs to make sure that the genetics have changed so much. That's the only way you could explain that, and we haven't had that. So on the contrary, you would expect that it would be the other way around. Obese people are less likely to live long and less likely to have a lot of children, less likely to attract mates, perhaps. So if anything, the fat genes should be getting weeded out or getting less common in society. And yet we've seen obesity go from maybe 1% to 30, 40, 50, 60%, depends on how you define it. But it's gone up so much. And the answer, of course, is not genetic. The answer is the food environment. The answer is because 100 years ago, people ate a lot more normal, natural food, a lot less heavily processed food. They ate a lot less of the, particularly, I think the most important ones is the grains, the processed grains, flour, things like that. So we've switched the food environment from being predominantly meat-based, which was the case at the early 20th century. Either you ate meat if you had money, and if you were really poor, you ate basically plants that were relatively fresh. Not a lot of heavily processed food. So with that, you see the population shifts to becoming a lot more obese today because of this food. And the idea that it is genetic, I don't think it makes any sense. And I think the same thing applies when you look at issues of virtue. If you think, and I would tend to agree, that today there's a lot less virtue in the world than probably in the past. I don't think this is just sentimentalism. I don't think it's just because I'm getting older. I think by many objective measures, you look around, you see a lot of places where, you hear stories where 100 years ago it was common for people to leave their doors open, and now things are becoming very different. There's a lot more crime, a lot less social cohesion. So these things are happening, but I don't think it's it can be explained with genetics or anything like that. I think it's the same population. So put them under a gold standard 150 years ago, you were less likely to witness these kind of things. You had more social cohesion. You had people who, for whom virtue mattered. And with time, as you switch to a world in which, as I like to explain it, in my in the Bitcoin standard and the Fiat standard, I focus on the aspect of money and time preference. As the money declines, people's ability to provide for the future declines, and so the future becomes less certain. So people start discounting the future more and caring less about the future, and all that leads to them becoming more present-oriented, which means behaving in a way that satisfies present immediate needs and provides gratification in the present at the expense of the future. The Bitcoin Standard podcast is brought to you by CoinKite. CoinKite are my favorite makers of Bitcoin hardware. They produce the legendary Open Dime, the first Bitcoin bearer asset, as well as the reliable Cold Card hardware wallet, the excellent stainless steel seed plates for storing your seed phrases, and the block clock. Now, CoinKite have produced the Sats card, a card the size of a credit card which can store Bitcoin and works great as a gift. CoinKite have just produced a limited edition gorgeous Bitcoin Standard Sats card, which carries the Bitcoin Standard logo, and you can get it from coinkite.shop/Bitcoin Standard. Use the code Bitcoin Standard to get 5% off your purchase. This podcast is also brought to you by the Bitcoin Way, your professional Bitcoin IT team offering you personalized, secure, and comprehensive solutions for every step along your Bitcoin journey. The Bitcoin Way offer live concierge service to guide you with your Bitcoin cold storage, running your node, privacy best practices, inheritance planning, corporate strategy, and multi-sig solutions. They don't touch your coins, they guide you through the process of acquiring your coins and securing them. If you'd like to make your setup safer and more reliable, book a consult with them and see what they have to suggest. If you want to give someone the gift of Bitcoin, get them this professional service that will ensure they start off knowing exactly how to manage their coins and not lose them. Go to thebitcoinway.com and start Bitcoining more confidently.
Correct. I mean, this is undeniable, and I think this is the big aha moment that a lot of Bitcoiners have, which is, that's the genesis of the argument Bitcoin fixes this, right? Like, if you had to boil down the entire argument of why Bitcoin fixes anything, it's to do with time preference. And you wrote about that specifically in the Bitcoin Times Edition 5 that we did, and you wrote about it 10 times in your books. I take that as a given in the book. I say, okay, look, that is definitely important. What I then talk about is, how do we choose to behave? So, like, a couple of the things in there, I talk about, the difference between, what is the opposite of excellence, for example? Well, it's not bad, it's mediocrity and average, right? So in a society that holds up mediocrity as the thing that you should aspire towards, don't be surprised that you move away from excellence and you no longer climb the mountain, right? I talk about how you don't want equality what you actually want is fairness. And they're actually very different concepts, right? Like equality is unfair often. Like if we use the football analogy that you were talking about before, like if we just wanted every game to have a nice equal outcome, like you have to take away the goals from the better team and you have to give the goals to the worst team, right? Like that doesn't make any sense. But people sitting out there, talking about equality. I've got another point here about, we all know, and I think it doesn't take a lot of IQ to realize that equality of outcome, for example, is extremely evil. But in the book, I also talk about how equality of opportunity is also quite ridiculous. Like you can't have equality of opportunity unless you could somehow, pre-distribute all of the resources in the world equally everywhere somehow. If you gave everybody the same genetics, if you gave everybody the same parents, the same upbringing, like basically you'd have to nuke the world.
The big one, looks.
Exactly, all of it. Like so equality of opportunity is also a stupidity. Like so, I try and touch on all of these things that are necessary around, like, and I frame Bitcoin as the keystone. Like if you want to build a bridge, you need the keystone. And without the keystone, the bridge collapses. But the keystone itself is not enough without the rest of the stones around it. And to me, the rest of the stones are, what are these virtues, right? You need to cultivate responsibility in young men, particularly. You need to cultivate excellence. You need to cultivate duty. You need to cultivate self-restraint. You need to cultivate compassion as well. You need to there's a section in there which discusses how justice is fundamentally a virtue and it's extremely important, but justice untempered by compassion can become extremely rigid, right? So you need this sort of constellation of virtues which have a tension among them. There's another point in here. Okay, an interesting one. This will piss off a bunch of Bitcoiners. I talk about how freedom is not a virtue. Freedom is a value. It's something that you want to experience, but it comes specifically from the virtue of responsibility. So if I want to take away your freedoms, I don't do it overtly. This is what the communists and all the idiots, they did wrong, and they figured it out later how to do it better, is if I overtly take away your freedom, you're going to push back because you impact the feeling directly. But if I slowly erode your responsibility, you give away your freedom, right? You become more of a dependent instead of more of an autonomous agent. So I don't know if you want to pull on any of those threads, but this is essentially like your point about lowering the time preference that establishes an environment. If we look at the gold standard as proof, and if we think forward, if we project forward 100 years, the environment on a Bitcoin standard should nurture the masses and even the elites into a way of being that is more virtuous, granted, but what should those virtues be and how do we start cultivating them today? Which is like, this is where the two ideas come together.
Yeah, I wanna get into the virtues in a minute, but I wanted to comment on the whole freedom thing. I think I agree with you, and I think as I've matured more, I've become, even though I still consider myself a libertarian, but I don't think libertarianism means freedom. And I think this is a very immature way of thinking of it. I think that what you're talking about is liberality, libertinism. If your idea is freedom, it's the idea that I get to do what I want. And that's not what libertarianism is. And the more that you think about libertarianism critically, the more you try and iron out the inconsistencies in your worldview, the more I believe you arrive at a Rothbardian and Hoppian understanding of what libertarianism is. And for that, I think there's a great book called Getting Libertarianism Right by Hoppe. And generally, all of Hoppe's work is pretty great on this. But I think a key point here is that this notion that you want to be free is kind of meaningless. Things actually have consequences. And you can't just declare that you want to be free from consequences. So if you want to, for instance, you want the freedom to smoke weed, great. So this one was, 10 years ago, 15 years ago, this was one of the main selling points for libertarianism. A lot of people became libertarian because they wanted to smoke weed, because it truly is a travesty that people were having their lives ruined because they smoked a joint. The joint is relatively harmless, but getting caught with a joint is not harmless. It can destroy your life. And it truly is a travesty. And I still think that, the war on drugs and the way that it is fought was extremely criminal, unjustified. But this notion that your worldview revolves around people need to be free to smoke weed is very immature, because that on its own doesn't really mean anything. It's not about the freedom of doing particular acts. The correct framework for understanding this is the freedom to own property, and it's about property rights. And if the issue is about property rights, then you can clearly see why, just like you want to smoke weed, somebody might want to not live in an area where there are people who smoke weed. And there will be other people who want to live in that area. So, and if you go to an American city where they've legalized it now,
they're all liberal, lefty, psychotic.
Yeah, and I think it's a huge wake up call for a lot of us who thought, wow, this should be legalized, and it's a harmless plan. But you go to a park and you want your kids to play on the swings and slides, and there's a smell of weed everywhere, and there's people doing fentanyl and drugs and needles everywhere, and you have to look around on the floor because you don't want your kids to step on some heroin needle or something like that. So this kind of degeneration of the public space that has happened because of weed has made me far more sympathetic to the idea that people want to stay away from weed, or people may want to stay away from alcohol, or they want to live in places where these things don't exist. And so this notion that you as a libertarian support the right of people to smoke weed is for me meaningless, because if you want the right to smoke weed, what about my right to live in a place where there are no weed smokers? And I'm not saying we need to have a war on drugs like the US did. I'm not saying people should be thrown in jail for 20 years for smoking a joint. I'm saying that the correct libertarian framework is not pro-weed or anti-weed. It's pro-property rights. It's pro-people having the right to enter into living arrangements which allow them to live in the kind of society that they want. So if you want to smoke weed, then go live in a place where people smoke weed. And if I don't want to smoke weed, then I can live with people who don't want it. And so you find communities emerge where people have rules. And you can see this developing where, this city, if you want to live in this city, there's a contract you need to sign, and the contract stipulates that you can't smoke weed. And you don't need, and once it's contractual, once it's voluntarily agreed to, then you don't need a police state. You can just tell people, if you want to live in the city, you need to do a drug test once a month. That's it.
Yeah.
And so then, or, random drug tests or whatever, you arrange a sort of framework where you don't need to be going around and having police shooting at 17-year-olds in order to stop them from selling weed to each other. You just test people, and then there are clear contractual rules that say what happens if you fail the drug test. Well, if you fail the drug test, then you don't belong in this neighborhood. Then you have to sell your house, or you have to pay a fine, or some sort of arrangement is done. Now, you might think, well, why would anybody want to get into something like this? Why would you want to put yourself in that position? And I think the answer is go to San Francisco, go to Toronto, and see why you might want to do that. The answer is people who would willingly accept these kind of things because they don't want to be around those things. And then you think, well, okay, but maybe not enough people want to do that. Maybe not enough people care. Well, maybe. And I think I don't advocate any particular solution for this problem. I'm not talking about it from the perspective of, we need to have societies that are weed free. I think we'll have places where weed is allowed, places where people don't want weed. And then I think the reason why people are going to want to go to the places that don't have weed is because these places are likely to be more peaceful, better for raising children, more accommodating for capital accumulation and civilization in general. And so I think, and Hoppe is pretty brutal in this criticism, what he calls the Lala libertarians, which is that he says, look, if you want you should have the right to do whatever you want with your own property. However, history has a lot of lessons for us, and it shows us how societies function. So we have not developed civilizations in societies that have been completely permissive to all kinds of behavior. There's a reason that societies that have developed civilization, that have been able to develop a concept of property rights, that have been able to develop peaceful coexistence, have some forms of common norms that they've adopted that have allowed for this. And so one of these is some form of social ostracism or restrictions against drugs, which doesn't necessarily mean that everybody's been sober at all times, but I think it does mean that there is a social stigma around it, so that even the people who do it underground and don't do it openly. And I think this is a pretty common thing. I don't think you'll find many societies where people engaged in a lot of drug use that ended up developing high civilization. I think another major one is family. And so you can expect to see that, whereas, in the last couple of decades, because of, I believe, the invention of the pill and contraception, as well as the development of much lower time preference behavior, all of these things have led to a lot more sexual liberation. And I think people think of this as being advancement. I think most people, particularly young people, when they're, overcome with hormones, before you start having kids, you think of this as being a lot of people think of this as being the pinnacle of human liberty and human achievement, is to be able to be liberated sexually. But the point is, if you want civilization, you have to give up on that. That this is a very, very, very powerful lesson of history. There's a great book written in the 1930s by a British sociologist called J.D. Unwin, and it's called Sex and Culture. And he examines how civilizations only emerge in places that have very strict restrictions on sexuality. In particular, he finds that high civilizations only developed in purely monogamous societies. And there's a reason for that. And so when people think that they can have the fruits of civilization without needing to
planting the seeds,
without needing to plant the seeds for it, then you're in end times territory. You're in the generation that is basically cutting down the trees that their ancestors built and leaving no trees behind for their children. Essentially, the boomer generation is the advertisement for this, because in the 60s and 70s, this stuff seemed harmless. Well, now we've got the pill and we have female liberation, and we can just do whatever we want. We have modern technology. We are advanced. We don't need to live in the old tribal traditional forms of society. We don't need religion. We don't need God. And so we can just continue to do whatever we want. And it sounded like a good idea for most people in the 1960s and 70s, because it didn't sound like, well, what could go wrong? Everybody just is sexually liberated and everything.
Combine that idea and then one shot them all with LSD, and then you get basically what happened. It was very well executed.
Sorry, but I'm not even sure that you could say that there was some kind of nefarious agenda here, because this is what has happened with civilizations, with civilizations all over time. In that, it starts off fun in the 60s and 70s. This was fun, but
totally,
the children that came from this then had the children that came from this that then today lead us to the mess that you see. And I think a lot of people like to talk about the insanities of modern gender and sexuality and all of this craziness that is as we speak, Trump is likely going to reverse a lot of that, at least nominally, from a government position. But I think this stuff is not just some kind of outlier where a few people have been pushing this agenda on society. I think this has been a long time coming. This is the inevitable consequence of that. So when these are the grandkids of the generations of the 60s and 70s who thought, what's the worst that can happen? What's the worst that can
Exactly.
happen is that your kid is gonna have drag queen story
He's going to chop
hour.
off his dick, basically.
Yeah, he's gonna have
exactly.
his dick chopped off at 7 years old because he once played with a Barbie. And
Yes.
that's, and that's just what we know now. Who knows what's going to be the case for 10, 20 years from now. So this kind of thing will lead to people recognizing this. You'll realize that places where they don't do this insane nonsense end up having functioning societies, end up having functioning sewage, electricity, and buildings. And you'll realize that if you want those things, you need to abide by the rules of civilization. I think if we have freedom, if we have more freedom and less government intervention, we'll be able to arrive at the forms of social organizations that are best optimized for society to thrive. But I don't believe it means what Hoppe terms the Lala libertarian viewpoint of just everybody indulge all of your desires at all times and never restrict yourself or delay gratification. That's not how civilization works. Healthcare is one of the biggest problems in fiat world, and health insurance in particular. In my work and on this podcast, we've discussed at length the many ways in which modern medicine and insurance fail, and I'm very proud to be presenting my listeners with an excellent Bitcoin-based alternative. Crowd Health is a crowdfunding model for health problems, and one that can save you enormously compared to the broken insurance model. I've hosted the founder Andy Schoonover twice to discuss Crowd Health, and everyone I've recommended to join them has been very satisfied. For $175 for an individual, or $575 for a family of 4 or more, you'll get access to a community of people who are willing to help out in the event of an emergency. Let Crowd Health help you with your healthcare needs. Get started today for just $99 per month for your first 3 months by using code SAFE, S-A-I-F, at joincrowdhealth.com. Crowd Health is not insurance. Learn more at joincrowdhealth.com and use the code SAFE, S-A-I-F.
I couldn't agree more. I mean, the 10th virtue in the book is restraint, and self-restraint is the capacity to limit your own freedoms. But I want to pull on a couple threads. So a bunch of what you talked about reminds me of the saying, just because you can doesn't mean you should. And I think that should be like stamped or branded on a bunch of libertarians' minds. It's like, just because you can, go and take drugs and do whatever you want, that doesn't mean you actually should. There are standards, which to me, standards are an interesting word because in many ways they're somewhat antithetical to liberty, or maybe antithetical is not the right word, but it's a tricky situation when you want a standard, but you also want the freedom to, often ignore that standard, right? A standard is in many ways either a limitation or a bar or a restriction of some sort, right? It's a bounding box. So it's like what you're describing about societies that may not, for example, tolerate, all right, we're not going to tolerate weed or junkies or this or that or whatever. That is a standard. And the trade-off for a standard is a limitation or an imposition on a freedom, right? Like you can't just have it all. And this is, for me as well, the older I get, the more mature I get, is like you realize you can't have it all. There are trade-offs. And I want to read a passage here from the book, which kind of talks to a lot of what we've been talking about. So the quote is, "It's not freedom that you actually want. What you actually want is agency and autonomy. Freedom is a nebulous term like spirituality, which devoid of a clearly defined frame doesn't mean anything. At that point, we are talking specifically about autonomy, the capacity to choose from a set of available options. Absolute freedom is absolute chaos, which doesn't really exist, or if it does, is unstable or unsuitable for life. Freedom maximalism quickly falls apart with one question: where does your freedom end, considering it may be in conflict with my freedom? This conundrum proves that freedom is only meaningful if it exists within a framework of duties, responsibilities, and boundaries, which is really the definition of autonomy. And if you really want to enhance your freedom, you need to increase your responsibility and the boundary of your domain, which requires power. You are not entitled to freedom, you can only earn it. When someone tries to unjustly take what you have earned, you must fight to protect it, and you cannot do that without taking responsibility or having property, which requires power. So consider the military dictum that rank hath its privileges. Privileges can be understood as liberties or freedoms, and that they come along with rank is not accidental, because the privilege of rank implies the burden of responsibility. So this is kind of comes from the freedom and responsibility chapter, which is it ties into many ways what you just mentioned before. It's these things come down to property, and in fact, I would argue that property is that which you have the capacity to protect, or that which you are responsible for. Right? It is your domain. You know, like so. So there's I know there's a bunch there if you'd like to pull on those threads, but this leads me to a discussion that I wanted to have with you, which is why inevitably with all of these sorts of things going on, I think the more you mature, the more you come to the realization that the ultimate means or mechanism for territorial organization boils down to monarchies. I think they are where things end up, because you, like, as soon as you go into, you know, one man, one vote, democracy and all this sort of stuff, you start to muddle the waters. Like, all of these problems around standards get way trickier to contend with in that kind of a framework, whereas in a, you know, a monarchic framework, or in the book I call it kind of executive states. I kind of paint a picture of the future where we have almost like CEO kings operating territories, and, you know, these territories are run more like some blend of a company and a monarchy, right? And you have a contractual relationship with the territorial operator. But yeah, the freedom, liberty, responsibility, like that cluster of things there, you know, with standards and everything else in there is tricky. And as you said, like the young, naive, immature conceptualization of freedom, or lolbertarians, right, which I call them, or lala libertarians, like they haven't thought these things through. And as you said, often they're people who either don't have kids, or they're young, or they're, you know, full of, you know, testosterone or whatever, and they just want to do whatever they want, right? They haven't thought a little bit deeper about what are the consequences for these decisions that I make as an individual for the community, tribe, or territory that I live within. And those things are much harder to contend with.
Yeah, I think, you know, what you said is what you're looking for is autonomy and agency, and I think this is very much in the Hoppian mold. But the kind of economist way of describing this in a more economically precise language is property. It's how you know, you said the question is, how do you what happens when your freedom conflicts with mine? And the answer is property rights. You can do whatever you want on your land. I can do whatever I want on my land, and or whatever we agreed to be doing. So if you have clearly defined property rights, then freedom becomes the consequence of that. And it's the freedom to be able to reap the rewards of what you plant. Basically, it's not so much about being able to do everything. It's about being able to experience the consequences, good or bad. That's really what freedom is. So a lot of people think, you know, libertarianism means people will get away with murder because there's no government. No, I think in a world in which we have real libertarianism in terms of property rights, then it'll be a lot harder for people to get away with murder than they can with government. Because ultimately what government does is that it pretends to be out there to protect people, but it really establishes a monopoly on violence. And so therefore it creates a category of violence that is legitimate. And so it creates a class of society that is allowed to engage in violence. And therefore, this class of society has a different set of rules by which they play. And I think this is truly corrupting of society in a sense, because once you see that there's this always growing, obviously because people want to be part of this group, this growing group of people who have the ability to commit crimes that you are unable to commit, then the entire notion of wanting to take part in society and take part in civilized society, I think, begins to fall apart. It's I think really one of the nefarious things that government does is that it introduces this idea that it's legitimate to have violence, and therefore people start thinking of it in terms of, how do I make it so that I'm the one who can have legitimate violence, rather than just accepting that nobody should have legitimate violence, and so therefore I should go and do something productive with my time. But if we have property rights, then if property rights override government, then you have peace and prosperity and civilization. But if you have government overriding property rights, It's going to override them all the time, and it's going to abuse that privilege all the time.
So here's a question for you. How do we, and this is something I contend with in the book a little bit, but I intend to, in the next couple of years, write something more dedicated to it. But how does one create a framework in which property rights can be protected and enforced? Because the things get tricky. For example, like let's say there's this whole mass immigration discussion now, right? Is like you bring people from external cultures into your culture, and your culture might respect private property rights and have this sort of implicit ability to agree on things, but then you start to import a bunch of people who that notion of property rights is completely foreign to them. They've never grown up with it. It's never been in their culture, never been in their DNA. It's outside to them. So then they don't live by those property rights, and then obviously they get a vote, and all this sort of shit happens, and all of a sudden, the concept of property rights start to fall apart. So, how does one, in your mind, operate a territory in such a way that property rights are respected? Does the territory operator have a monopoly on the violence? Like, this is sort of where I end up coming back to the monarch, right? Or a CEO king. So talk me through your thinking there.
Yeah, no, that's another one of these great ideas that I think grown-up libertarianism, as I like to call it, the Hoppe branch of libertarianism, has a coherent answer for that the Lala libertarians don't, because I think the Lala libertarian position of governments are illegitimate, states are illegitimate, and therefore borders don't matter, and therefore people get to move around. I don't think that is coherent. And I think Hoppe makes a good case for saying, look, even if you don't support the government, say you don't support the idea of public libraries, so you don't like the idea of government taxing people in order to build public libraries, which I believe is a fair position. I think in a free society, people will build libraries voluntarily without having to be extorted to build a library.
As they did.
Yep. Yeah, and they did. But so if you have a public library today in a city and you don't believe in public libraries, that doesn't necessarily mean that you support the right of random hobos to get into the library and squat it and call it theirs. So it's not unowned property that somebody can come in and squat in. And, random homeless people get into the library and start burning all the old books to stay warm and throw a party in it. Well, aren't you an anarchist? Aren't you a libertarian? Don't you oppose the government? Those people are sticking it to the man, sticking it to the government. They've ruined a 300-year-old library and turned it into a giant bonfire. You should be happy, right? No, I'm not happy with that. I don't want that to happen. Ideally, I'd want the public library to be privatized. I want to have an owner of the library because I believe that would be a better way of protecting the library. But meanwhile, if I see a homeless person defecating inside the library, I'm not just going to say, oh, well, it's government property, so that means he can do whatever he wants. No, the fact that it is government property means that it should be managed to the benefit of the taxpayer. The taxpayers are the people paying for this. And so I don't believe this is a perfect way of arranging things. I would rather just have a person open a library and take donations or charge a fee or whatever. But it is what it is right now when we have the library, and we're not going to get rid of nice things just because we don't support the government. Another great example would be, just to say, think of a situation where there is somebody who's kidnapping someone, and you see somebody snatch a child and he's running away with the child. And you see a policeman and he's got a gun and he can shoot the guy and stop him. And he's a very good shot. He can shoot him in the legs, make sure he hits him, and doesn't hurt the child. Now, the policeman is funded with taxation. Taxation is theft. So as a libertarian, does that mean that you would oppose the policeman shooting the kidnapper so that the kidnapper can just get away with kidnapping someone's child? No, there is the evil of the kidnapping right now, and the fact that the policeman is being paid through taxation and the bullet is being paid for through taxation, which is illegitimate, does not invalidate the need to deal with the kidnapper. I'd rather be in a place where kidnappers get shot and killed,
Mm-hmm.
rather than
Mm-hmm.
rather than be in a place where we get to quibble all day about the morality of the police and what should we do with the police. The reality is the public library exists, the policeman exists, and the roads exist. The roads are funded by the government, and I'm not going to not ever go on a road because it is funded by the government. This is the reality of what it is. And so with this frame of mind, when you think about it from the concept of immigration, I think ideally you would want to have everything be private property. And then if things are on private property, I think you would see that people would get into voluntary arrangements that will exclude people from being part of it. And I think that's going to be a lot more common than people think. I think governments have, in a sense, undermined property rights, which has made it so that a lot of the surface area of a particular city or country is essentially unowned, and therefore people can squat onto it and people can enter into it, and people can go into geographic regions by just simply getting a paper from an embassy, or by just crossing borders between countries. But I think in a free world, in a truly free world, that doesn't mean that the freedom of an immigrant to go to a place that he doesn't have anything to do in, and to have the ability to go around and benefit from a civilization that he and his parents did not contribute to, would be subject to the acceptance of the people who built that civilization, the people who own the property there. So you would think about the example of gated community. I think you'd have gated communities and they'd have clear, strict criteria about what it means to enter here. So in this community, we're all Christians. We all want to live in a society that's all Catholic Christians. And so only people who are Catholic Christians are allowed to buy property in this area. We're only going to be selling to Catholic Christians. And if you decide to become an atheist, there are certain criteria. You got to attend church maybe once a month at least, or some kind of criteria to guarantee it. And if you truly believe in freedom, I mean, freedom isn't just drugs and sex. What about if I want to live in a society where I want my children to share the faith that of the kids in their school? I want them to play with people with the same values. I think that's a freedom, and I think that is a freedom that will happen in a more free society, that people will impose these kind of rules that say, okay, well, we are going to mandate that in this area, only people from this particular faith are allowed to come here. Or, you can imagine something happening where, for instance, in the cities, where you're likely going to need more of a diverse kind of labor force, where you're going to benefit from having people, then you would have areas in cities, or maybe the centers of cities, that would have pretty open immigration policies. But then think about the suburbs outside it would be pretty exclusionary, and there'd be gated communities. And it might be the case that very large geographic areas voluntarily choose to accept these kind of restrictions. So I don't believe in this. I think Hoppe's convinced me on the idea that open borders is not the libertarian positions.
Yeah, open borders is stupid.
Yeah, the idea the borders are just a libertarian world is a world in which every single inch is owned, and so there is nothing to be open. Anywhere you go, you're crossing onto somebody's property, and so you need to abide by their rules. There are no roads for you to go and be a hobo on. Every single road is owned by somebody, and that person can impose whatever restrictions they want. They could impose the death penalty for sleeping on the street if they choose to, and you only enter into that street when you agree to abide by this. So in that kind of world, you'd get more and more of this kind of these kind of restrictions. And I think it would looking around at what's going on in Europe in particular, I mean, this kind of mass immigration phenomena, I don't think this would happen in a free society. And it didn't happen in the 19th century, which I believe was in many ways a more free society, because they had the gold standard, they had limited governments, and they had monarchies. And I think this is a key point here. So I don't necessarily think that monarchy is always the solution everywhere. For me, kings can be bad and parliaments can be bad. I think parliaments are more likely to be bad, but there are good examples of republics that haven't been a complete failure. Switzerland is one. So I think, but I still think monarchy is more likely to be conducive to this kind of solution, because monarchy essentially formalizes the property, all of the property that is not owned, and makes it effectively the property of the king. And so then you have that formalism of the idea that since the king owns all of those things, you can't just trespass. And the king has a long-term interest. He wants to have his kids and grandkids and great grandkids in charge. So he's got a very low time preference. He's interested in keeping you as a citizen, as a subject. He's interested in making you prosperous enough so that your great grandchildren will be prosperous enough for his great grandchildren to be able to tax. So he's interested in peace, he's interested in development, he's interested in growth, he's interested in capital accumulation, he's interested in civilization. And I believe in that kind of world, you're likely going to see a lot more restrictions on immigration. Or I think alternatively, what you would see is you look at the model of places like Dubai or the Emirates, where you have an enormous amount of immigration, but there's a very clear idea of
citizen resident.
Exactly. So you're a resident, and there are very clear rules about what you're allowed to do and what you're not allowed to do. And if you don't want it, you don't come. And I think it's really telling. People in the West like to hate on Dubai and Saudi Arabia, and a lot of people talk about it being slavery, that it's built on slave labor, which is idiotic, because there are hundreds of millions of people who are eager to move to the Arab Gulf today. I mean, I am sure there are hundreds of millions of people all over the world, in Asia, Africa, Latin America, North America, Europe, Australia, who would move there if they could have the chance. And they move there even though they don't get a vote, they don't get to take part in politics, there's no demonstration, there's no political activism, none of that stuff. And yet they move there. And I used to live in Lebanon, and Lebanese people, Lebanon is a massively dysfunctional country politically. It's a republic and a parliament that's designed by the French, and they have 18 sects, and everything is based on sect. And so it's just massively dysfunctional. And of course, everybody has very strong opinions about how the country needs to be run. And everybody believes that, if only me and the right people like me were made president, then everything would be fixed. And yet, probably a majority of Lebanese people would move to Dubai if they could, and the Gulf. I think probably, I don't really know the numbers, but there might be more Lebanese people in the Gulf countries than there are in Lebanon at this point. Maybe not quite as much, but a very significant number of Lebanese people have been in Saudi Arabia and the Emirates and Kuwait and Qatar for decades. And they go there, and suddenly all of their strong ideas about politics are just completely out of the window. Yeah. They no longer want activism. They no longer want to vote. They no longer want to have very strong opinions about how the country is run. They sign their contract. They go there. They behave, and they get paid, and they live a decent life, much better life than the life that they would have had in Lebanon, or for many other people from all over, from India and Nepal and everywhere, and Australia as well. Lots of refugees from Australia and in Dubai now. They get a better life because there's a king, and a king runs the country with the perspective of making sure that it is functioning 100 years from now. And of course, it's not perfect, and of course, they have all kinds of problems there. But the streets are clean, the electricity works 24/7, the infrastructure is impeccable, and everything is very, very, very safe. There's very little crime in these places.
There's trade-offs, and this is the thing you realize as you get older, right? Is like each one of these things has a trade-off. Like if you just want to make everything free, liberal, and anyone can do whatever they want, well, don't be surprised to turn your whole civilization into San Francisco, right? And then if you want to take the alternate trade-offs, I use Dubai as a massive example in the book, actually, and I talk specifically about that. So 93% of the Arab Emirates population is non-Emiratis. You cannot sustain your country, your ethnicity, without having a multi-tier system where your people, by blood, are the only ones who get to assemble and get to vote. Simple as that. And the funny thing is, this isn't funny. The tragic thing is the West, the European blood was like that. You look at Rhodesia, South Africa, America, they were all like that originally, And when they changed, to make it equal for everybody, their countries got overrun. I mean, are you familiar with the story of Rhodesia?
Not so much, vaguely, but yeah, go ahead.
So, a lot of Bitcoiners talk about, Zimbabwe, went into hyperinflation because they printed trillions of dollars. That's actually not true. Zimbabwe, the hyperinflation occurred as a result of Rhodesia becoming Zimbabwe. It happened before the money printing started. The money printing was a symptom of the collapse of the prior society. So previously, Rhodesia was like close to like a landed republic, right? So you only got a vote, you only got a say in politics if you had a threshold of property ownership, right? And it stood in stark contrast with the rest of the world, because after World War II, as we know, the whole democracy, liberal democracy, was being rammed down everybody's throats as the panacea to all social problems, right? Rhodesia was the breadbasket of the entire continent of Africa, with less than 5 million people, and it was a landlocked nation. They fed the entire continent of Africa, and it was a landed republic. The West destroyed its own ally by embargoing its own ally when it needed arms, when the Chinese communists and the Russian communists went in and attacked it. And they held off two of the biggest powers. They held off both China and Russia by themselves as a tiny population to maintain their way of life, because they had this thing working for almost a century. And of course, after the embargo, after the UK and the US turned their backs on them, when they were infected with this idea of democracy and all this kind of shit, there's a whole story there. Their own ally, Rhodesia, collapsed, failed. Mugabe got in. They installed Mugabe as the new leader of the Democratic Republic of Zimbabwe. They killed off all the farmers. They took all the property. And then the country collapsed. Then they started printing money. And the reason the money didn't work, because people had no faith in the new governance, right? So the way I look at money is like, money is a function of people's faith in it. Bitcoin is building a track record of a kind of money that you can have the utmost faith in, right? And therefore it provides the basis of a civilization where people can start to be low time preference. If you live in a society where, you just got toppled and all of your best people got either killed or their property taken and all this sort of stuff, and then you say, well, don't worry, I'm going to print a bunch of money and give it to you. Like, you have zero faith in that. It's going to collapse. So I've gone off on a tangent here, but it reminds me of, like, the West used to know this, and we've buried it all. And we've buried it in this sort of guilt of, we colonized some people and now we should pay for all the price and the consequences and everything like that. We should, adopt this libertine policy of, opening everything and bending over and letting anybody do whatever they want. And that has led us to the point, as we said earlier, is like your kids chopping off their dicks. Like, it's not a good outcome. Like, that should be the measure of society, right? Like, if your kids are chopping off your dicks, your society has failed. Like, not the GDP or how much growth you had or how much the stock market went up. Like, children chopping off their genitals, that's the measure of society. And if they're not doing that, then guess what? You have the makings of a better society than you do the alternate way, irrespective of all the micro details.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great point. I think, recently, remember the migration, the H-1B visa debate that became quite a shitstorm on Twitter in particular. And in particular, it was Elon Musk and Vivek Ramaswamy who you could say shot themselves in the foot or put their foot in their mouth by this. And I think one of the very ridiculous ideas, which I would have been more sympathetic to in an earlier time before reading a lot of Hoppe, is this kind of, well, we need to get the best engineers in the world so that we can compete with China, so that we can beat China. And it fundamentally misunderstands what society is. It takes the analogy of a sports team and
Mm-hmm.
applies it to a society. And I think the extension of this analogy, and I've seen several people make this tweet, which is, you don't replace your child if somebody finds you a child who's better at math. You don't walk around looking for somebody who's better at math or somebody who's going to make a better income when he grows up, and then you just go and get rid of your child and replace him. Or you adopt people based on the fact that they're going to provide you with a better income. um, I mean, of course, there are good reasons to adopt people, and maybe this is the case, but your child is your child, and you try and give your child the best life possible because he's your child. And of course, you'd like him to succeed, you'd like him to do good things, but it's his life, his existence is not a competition with other people.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a very statist and silly idea that we're out there competing. No, we don't have to compete. We don't have to have the best engineers in the world in our country to be making everything. We can just import stuff from abroad. It's fine. They can stay in their country. They can make all the amazing things that they want to do, and then we can just import them. And this is becoming more and more obvious at this point, because it's completely absurd to imagine the opposite. This notion that in today's modern world, today's modern economy, that the US could become self-sufficient is completely ridiculous. Not the US, not China. No country is truly self-sufficient. Even China, with 1.5 billion people and having essentially more than half of the world's steel capacity and a very large amount of the capacity of production for most of the world's most important economic goods. Most of the world's electronics and computers and everything is being made in China these days. And yet, if you tried to isolate China from the rest of the world, you would massively destroy the living standards of Chinese people. If they can't trade with the rest of the world, if they can buy and sell abroad, they are going to be a lot worse off. So this notion that you have to make everything in your country doesn't make sense. And this notion that your country is out there trying to win some Olympic gold medal in making
Productivity,
and productivity, or in making widgets, or making cell phones, or in making something. It's not true. That's not why a country exists. Just like your family is not out there to win anything. You love your family, whether they're good at what they do or not, and you care for your child. And this notion that, I mean, you can sort of see this perhaps in the context of the US, because the US has predominantly been an immigrant society. So you could say that the US is always going to be a country that is, well, I mean, some people would disagree with this, but you could make it more of a case that the US is more of a country built around values than European countries, which are really countries for a people, that it's built around the people. There's a place called Finland, and there are people who are the Finnish people who have been living in Finland, in that place. They own the property, they own the land, and they've been there. And Finland is not something that's made so that it can win a contest against other countries. That there's no, and also we can't all win all these contests. It's not the Olympics where there's one golden medal and then we can compete. It's good to have all this competitive stuff, get the outlet for it, have an outlet for it, which is sports. So be competitive about who's going to win the World Cup and who's going to get more Olympic medals, but don't I don't think it's very productive to think of your society as being something that needs to be out there competing with the rest.
Over the last couple of years, I've become, I must say, kind of like a quasi-statist, or like a Hoppian statist. Like I've got this framework, I call it Christo-Hopper-Nietzschean, and we'll get into that in a second. But your point here, like the word nation, and I think this is where things get conflated, particularly among libertarians, is like there's this real hatred for a state. It's like, okay, anything statism is bad. But the nation state, like the word natio means your kin, it means your people, right? And a nation state, the original incarnation of it, sure, it's devolved and it's changed and all this sort of stuff, but it demarcated a territory that was more than just an economic zone, which is what you're talking about here. Is like it was a cultural zone. It's a zone of your people who have particular norms, have particular way of thinking, have a particular genetic and ethnos, like a shared ethnos and all this sort of stuff. And the nation state's duty is first and foremost to its people. Like and you can't just look at your people like spreadsheet entries, right? It's like, okay, well, we look at the spreadsheet entry on the dimension of computer science and we bring them in. That doesn't work like that. And even, I mean, the funny thing is, all of the nerds and all of the people advocating for, importation of people and all this kind of thing, they know this in business, because in business it's a very well-known axiom that you hire for culture first and skill second, because you can always train skill, but you cannot embed culture in someone. Now, they say that about the cultural work environment, but then they go and ignore it about the person's cultural life, genetics, blood, upbringing, and everything like that. And it like, these things are inconsistent, they're incoherent. And it makes me think about, earlier you said about Switzerland, right? Switzerland has managed to be this unique territory, this unique region that has been able to establish and run a successful republic for many, many, many centuries. You can't just do that everywhere. There needs to be a culture or a cultural framework that can sustain a particular kind of governance, a particular kind of territorial operation. And I think it's very naive to think, for example, that the whole world can just be libertarian, that the whole world can just have the same type of cultural framework to support a type of governance form. And this is, I think, in writing this book, I've matured a lot in my views, in that I come to recognize that, hey, what the world really needs is something more of a patchwork of different kind of territorial operations, right? It's like, in some places, monarchies are going to work better. In some places, republics are going to work better. In some places, I mean, I don't know, maybe communism works just fine in China and they can do it over there, and that's their thing, right? Like, it's not our business to get involved in how they want to operate their ethnic boundary, and what they choose as their property in their territory, right? So, we can argue that, communism and all of that sort of stuff is stupidity and everything, but they will themselves around and find out. It reminds me of, I just finished reading the book on Joe Kennedy, who was like the father of, the founding father. I shouldn't say the founding father, because obviously he had his great grandfather came to America from Ireland, but the book is called The Patriarch. And man, he had 9 kids, and it shows how he went from nothing. He was like a, Boston Irish kid, bit of an outsider, and he established a massive fortune. He was one of the, top 100 richest people in America in his day. And he was totally against all of the intervention in World War II, the intervention of America. He was against like the spread of liberal democracy in America turning itself into an empire and all this sort of stuff. He was the original, like, make America great, and keep America great kind of thing. And you just sort of see this, he was ridiculed, he was laughed at, Roosevelt like kind of lied to him and, kind of him over like behind his back when he was the ambassador of England and trying to keep America out of the war and all this sort of stuff. And you kind of start to realize, like, these things are a hell of a lot trickier than what we think. Like, practice is way harder than theory, basically. And you can talk about theory all you want, but when it comes down to it, in practice, it seems that the best kind of territories are operated within a framework that can sustain them, number one. And number two, they look very much over and over again like something that has internal cultural coherence and is often operated in something that looks like a monarchy. I mean, also a republic has more in common with a monarchy than it does with a democracy. Like, that's another thing that people, don't realize.
Yeah, and I think the key thing is whatever the form of politics that your republic is going to have, it's the way that I see it, it's more difficult to get the ruling power in a republic to have a low time preference perspective on things, because you need to convince more people. In the case of a democracy, you need to convince 51% of people to have good ideas, which is almost impossible. In the case of a monarchy, you just need one guy.
Mm-hmm,
You just need
mm-hmm,
the one guy to figure it out. And they're quite likely to figure it out because if they've in that family business, if the family's been in the business of government for a couple of generations, they've learned a thing or two. If
yes.
you've had a few generations and you've managed to keep power for a few generations, then you have some foresight, you have some long-term perspective, you're able to take the low time preference decision. And then what really matters in the case of monarchy is that that family maintains that line of thinking generation after generation. And it's really a lot easier. So you're born, and the day you're born, you know that one day you're going to be king. And not only you, but all of your brothers and all of your cousins, all of the people that are, 50th in line for the throne, in case there's some giant war where the top 49 people in line for the throne get killed. Even the 50th guy is being essentially groomed to become
Groomed.
king.
Yeah.
And that's essentially what a royal family is. It's a very deep bench of people from a family that has a long culture of understanding how to rule. And all of these people are born from day one to handle this. So you look around at what monarchs do. I mean, from day one, they're out there doing things that are in the kind of public interest. They're
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm,
you
mm-hmm.
know one guy is interested in football, so he works with the football federation, and he helps use his connections with governments around the world to try and get I'm speaking from the experience here in Jordan. You see what the royal family are doing, and they're out there doing all kinds of public service thing, interested in helping the disabled, interested in promoting sports, interested in helping develop businesses and all kinds of things. And all of that is really just like a deep bench for monarchy. But it's a lot easier to instill those values within one family and make sure that they continue within the family than it is to instill it in a giant society of tens or hundreds of millions of people, because people are going within the context of democracy. Not only is it harder to teach those people, but also within the context of democracy, where you can get to vote for taking other people's stuff, there's a very strong incentive to have to have a high time preference in the way that you behave. And
Totally.
the proof is in the pudding. If you look at what are the great civilizations that we see, we find that monarchy has generally almost always been there. So the longest serving monarchy in the world, do you know which one it is?
It's in Japan, right?
It's in Japan, exactly. It's been about 2,600
Yep.
years. So
Yep.
there's been a royal family there for, I think, 50, 60 generations. No, sorry, about 100 generations or something like that. The royal family has been there. And, Japan isn't exactly a terrible place to be. The second longest dynasty, trivia quiz for the day. Do you know which one?
I mean, I'm going to just say Jordan because you're there.
Yep,
Am I
that's the correct answer.
okay?
The current king of Jordan is the 42nd
Yeah,
generation
well,
descendant of the Prophet Muhammad. So again, Islamic civilization, you can also think of it as being a monarchical, patriarchal civilization. It's always
mhm.
been around the family of Muhammad, who were in Mecca, but now they're in Jordan. But part of the reason that makes this country so stable and peaceful, not a lot of people hear about Jordan because nothing bad usually happens in Jordan. So really is the Switzerland of the Middle East, in a sense, that over the last 100 years, all of the neighbors of Jordan have had all kinds of horrific wars and conflicts all the time. And Jordan has practically stayed out of the vast majority of them. And people in Jordan have been quite peaceful. And I think a big part of that is because of the monarchy. So you see this all over the world. You see, the great European civilizations came under monarchies. The British, the Germans, the Spanish. There was all monarchies, and it was only in the 20th century that these monarchies,
It's
most of
been like
them.
a deviation. It's been like a strange deviation where, and this is why I think World War One was the death knell of the West. Was the whole point of World War One was
Exactly.
to abolish all of them. I wanna quickly say something. You were talking about monarchs, and it just hit me now. It's like monarchs are basically a combination of nature and nurture for governance, right? Because they're almost like genetically born into it, but they are also nurtured their whole life for the purpose of governance.
Yep.
Which that didn't occur to me before, but it's based on our conversation. Like it's a mixture of both, which is what you want. You don't want to
Yes.
just get anybody in there.
Yeah, it's very unpopular thing to say in our egalitarian time, but I
Yes.
urge people to look at the Republican leaders. You know, I've got a front seat to this, looking at the Arab world. So when you think about the leaders that came into power, who weren't monarchs, and you think of the sort of things that they did. So you compare, for instance, Saddam in Iraq versus the Hashemites, who used to rule Iraq. Or the Hashemites ruled Iraq before Saddam, and then they were removed. Or you compare them to the Hashemites today in Jordan. So Saddam invaded most of his neighbors, which was an extremely, extremely stupid thing to do. Whatever geopolitical context you have, it was just massively stupid and massively destructive. Invaded Iraq, invaded Iran. He came very close to fighting war against Syria. They were brutal enemies who hated each other and spied on each other, and it was terrible. He had terrible relationships with pretty much everybody because he's not a king. He never really thought about power from the perspective of, I want to secure this for my great 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 grandchild. It was always, I want to avenge this and I want to avenge that and I want to do this, and that's just very high time preference behavior that is inculcated into people who, I mean, well, I shouldn't say inculcated. I'd say this is the default. This is how people really are. And it takes a lot of restraint and a lot of nature and nurture combining to produce somebody who has the foresight to think, no, you know what? I can take Kuwait if I want to. I probably shouldn't.
But I shouldn't. Exactly. And this, I mean, this right there, what you just described is why I wanted to write this book, which is Bitcoiners are going to, in many ways, be the leaders of the future world. Like, you know, when you are, you know, economically and therefore socially, you know, you have gravity, you need to develop the virtues that make you worthy of that power, of that capacity, right? You need to start to do that, lest you become a degenerate, right? Because like the future leaders of the world, like many of the great Bitcoiners who go and cultivate these virtues inside themselves will be micro monarchs or potentially the future monarchs of the world, right? You know, we are going to establish and build a new world from scratch because we killed off all the other royal families. You know, there's like 3 left now on the planet. So we're going to have to rebuild civilization somehow. And when you combine the fact that the optimum territorial operation or the territorial organizational structure is something that looks more like a monarchy, with the fact that there will be people who have extreme wealth because they got into Bitcoin early and were able to pass it on to their children and their children's children, you have the forming of a future in which you have a patchwork of territories that look more like microstates and what I'm calling in the book executive states. That's kind of how I'm thinking about this. And I think that's a very interesting future, at least in my opinion. You know, people get very offended when I talk about this, but it's maybe I'm talking to the right audience here, so no one will be offended. But
I mean, I'm guessing people who listen to my podcast have seen a lot worse. So if they've stuck around so far, they've probably got a very high tolerance. So yeah, I think this. I mean, who knows? Maybe they'll get angry about it. But you know, I think it's very true. It's no coincidence that the move toward fiat money was at the same time that the move away from monarchies happened, and I think both are an aberration. It's a historical aberration that we live in a world with government money, and it's a historical aberration that we live in a world in which the majority of territories are just, you know, run by this, these bureaucrats, basically, these midgets who come into power for 4 years and leave.
I call it the twin evils: fiat money and liberal democracy. Like those two things, you combine those, and that's how you basically destroy the world. And you know, with Bitcoin, we must fix the money, and then through cultivating codes of virtue, through cultivating a way of life, we can develop into the kind of leaders that will move the world more towards ascendant values. Like if I had to sum it up, I've got this in my first line here as a takeaway: to build a better world, you need both capital and character. You need both. Like if you had to pick one, pick character, obviously, but capital amplifies everything, and that's the whole point of it. Like, so you need both, and Bitcoin solves the capital problem. It allows those with character to build and save for the future. They can compound, and that is fundamentally important, because if all the people with great character are poor and have no capital, they will easily be overrun by those with capital and no character, and we have no shortage of those in the modern world.
Indeed, absolutely. Okay, so can you walk us through a list of your virtues?
Yes.
We
Okay.
mentioned them, but I guess a list would be helpful.
Let me go to the section in the book so I can say them in order. That'll help people conceptualize a little bit better. Where is my list? There it is. So, virtue number 1, justice. Virtue number 2, courage. Virtue number 3 is compassion. I'm reading on the wrong list. Hold on, I'm reading the ancient Japanese list. God damn it. I just want to make sure I got these in order so people know. Okay, so justice, courage, compassion. Number 4 is honor. Number 5 is honesty and integrity. Number 6 is responsibility. Number 7 is excellence. Number 8 is respect. Number 9 is duty and loyalty. And number 10 is restraint and self-control. So they're designed to be a constellation of virtues, each which have some tension with respect to another one. And the idea here, which is very much like the idea of what the Japanese samurai looked to establish, was to have something well-rounded. I think a lot of the mistakes people make is like, okay, we must be justice and just above all else. It's like, well, yeah, that's good if you want to create, like a fucking rigid society where, if someone farts, you kill them, like that's probably not very healthy, right? Like you need to have that balance with a little bit of compassion. You need honor, but if you overdo honor, people might, go and kill themselves or kill their neighbor over the smallest slight. This was a big thing in ancient Japan or feudal Japan, where honor was such a strong virtue that the smallest transgression from somebody else would end up in a blood feud, right? So like you have to balance that stuff. So yeah, they're the 10 virtues. And in the book, what I do is that there's giant chapters on each virtue, where the first section of it is I go into the etymology of the word, into the Latin roots, down into the Proto-Indo-European roots. And then I also go into the Japanese kanji, the version of the word in Japanese. So like, let's say honesty, for example, is seijitsu in Japanese. And I'll go into the Japanese and Chinese etymology of that. And when you break down the words, like one of the things I found, and I didn't expect this when I was writing the book, was the actual fundamental building blocks of the words mean the same things across cultures that had nothing to do with each other. So the example that I used before about excellence, in fact, I want to pull up the etymological definition of excellence here. So in excellence, so character, excellence, mountains, these are the symbols of nobility and that which is most good. Why? It will make sense in the thing that follows. So the Japanese word which most closely translates to excellence or greatness is yushu, which is made up of 2 kanji. One of them conveys the idea of superiority, and for what some might seem counterintuitive, gentleness. So to be superior does not imply that one is brutish, but in fact comes with the inclination and duty to be kind and gentle. So that's kind of one part of the kanji. Then it's composed, I'm just kind of like reading through here. It is also the other component of the kanji suggests a person of outstanding qualities with an undertone of care and consideration. And then in the second part of the kanji, it combines elements meaning cereal or grain, which is an archaic possessive particle meaning soft and clingy. The imagery of the character can be thought of as a grain stalk that stands out for being particularly tall or well-developed, symbolizing the idea of being outstanding or exceptional. And it can also be interpreted as the one who possesses the grain, which would denote status or nobility. So then when you look at the English one, in English, the word excellence comes from the Latin excellentia, which means superiority or eminence. It refers to the quality of being outstanding or exceptional at something. And the word itself comes from ex, meaning out from, and celere, to rise high or to raise a tower. So looking at all of the etymology, when I did the deep dive on all of these things, there was a relationship between these different languages about what these virtues mean, which, goes into the idea that, words are deeper than what we think of today. They actually have a root or a meaning. So long way of answering your question, but that's the 10 virtues. And I go, like, after the etymology, I go into basically examples from history, whether it's Alexander the Great or Hopper or Brand or Napoleon or whatever. And I use examples of these 10 virtues and how they were embodied and exhibited by the greatest of the great, who, the way I describe it in the book, is who bent the arc of eternity, or bent the arc of history towards them. That's the conception.
Yeah, and I think if you understand these things as, if you understand these things deeply as being necessary for the thriving of society, you realize it's no coincidence that they emerge everywhere, because the only reason that these people who had these things were able to develop a society that was complex enough for them to sit down and write books and transmit those ideas across generations, for us to download them in PDFs today and look at them and find the incredible coincidence of having all of these things reflected across cultures, is because these things work for the purpose of making society possible. So whether it's in Japan or in Europe or wherever, people who follow these things and venerate these ideals end up building societies that allow people to sit down and write about those things and transmit that knowledge across time. And so it's no coincidence. It's why these things work. It's that they allow us to have these functioning societies, and it's the ideal that people have always aspired to. And when they arrive or when they get close to that ideal, then things look good, and when they move away from that ideal, then bad things happen.
People start chopping off the dicks.
Yeah. All right, so I wanted to talk about the Austrian school. So you mentioned Alfred Adler, and that's an Austrian school, but psychology, not in economics. So what is the Austrian school in psychology, and are they as based as the Austrian school in economics?
Very much so. So, all three of those, Jung, Freud, and Adler, were contemporaries, and they were all differing Austrian schools. And it was incredible. It was like, this was the golden age of civilization, right? Where these great thinkers came to be. But Alfred Adler specifically is the forgotten father of psychology. And I've been following Adler's work for quite a while. I've always been, for the last 15 years, I've been pissing off all of my friends and family and everything by telling them that depression is a scam, basically, and depression is not something you have, but it's something you do. In order to do depression, you need to be selfish, you need to be weak, you need to be
you need to eat garbage.
Exactly, all this sort of stuff, right? So it's like, depression is a thing you do, it's not a thing you have. And Adler's work kind of spoke about a lot of this. So Adler did away with the concept of trauma, for example. His idea was that, look, it's not that you've had a trauma that predisposes you to act in a particular way. You act in a particular way and then you justify it with your trauma, right? Like, so he flipped things on its head. And his whole philosophy around psychology is that you are the actor, you are the agent, and what happens to you, you take in, you apply a meaning to it, and then you choose what to do with it in accordance with that which you believe. And if you believe you are a traumatized person, then you will act in accordance with that, and you will behave in that way. And funny enough, it does away with therapy. It does away with drugs and SSRIs and all this sort of stuff, because it is completely incompatible with that model of psychology that is taught in the world today, where you're a victim and, we're going to give you 6,000 labels. Now you're depressed, now you're anxious, now you're this, now you're that. His school of psychology does away with all of that sort of stuff. And it's really rough. I do a whole section in the book specifically. I call it the psychology of responsibility. And it's gonna, I know when people read this, it's gonna make them angry. I've got a section here. So it says Adler infamously didn't believe in trauma, which triggered his contemporaries and especially modern psychologists. He didn't deny the existence of traumatic events, of course, nor the mental and emotional scars they leave, but he emphasized that people have the capacity to choose and direct their behavior and therefore their reaction to such events. Yes, you may be traumatized, but that's not the end of the story. Instead of placing yourself at the effect of trauma, powerless against it, you have the agency to deal with it. And funny enough, the world we live in is completely ignores his whole form of thinking. The next paragraph says his work is largely glossed over in modern psychology, most likely because it negates the need for ongoing therapy, medication, and the never-ending labeling of every emotion as a syndrome or disorder. Not unlike how the Austrian School of Economics, which does away with the bureaucratic central banking apparatus, is conveniently ignored. Coincidentally, Adler too was Austrian. There was clearly something about that region and era. So,
Yeah, I agree. I think I would say maybe pre-World War One Vienna may have been the pinnacle of human civilization. I think you look at the kind of scholarship and the culture that was emerging at that point. There's a case to be made that it may have been there. And yeah, I very much agree with this analysis. And I've tweeted a few times about how much I think psychiatry is a scam, and
totally.
more than just a scam. I think it's a criminal enterprise, and this is probably going to piss off some of my listeners, but I truly think it is. And I think also, psychology as well, getting people to sit on couches and talk on things. I think it's hugely destructive. I've seen so many people whose lives are destroyed by therapy because the business model here is that you need the guy to come back to your couch. If your business model is you make money from people sitting on your couch and opening up, you need them to come back. So the priority is how to make them come back. And then, of course, with SRSRIs, it's just downright criminal. You give people drugs that are completely truly criminal. I mean, the people don't really understand what these drugs do. They put them through the corrupt FDA process, and they just get people to become dependent on them. And of course, the best argument for those drugs that people give is, oh no, if people quit them, then very bad things happen. Exactly, which is why they shouldn't be on them in the first place. But I think you're absolutely correct in that the business of psychology and psychiatry is a business, and in fiat world, business, people don't have savings, so business needs recurring revenue. So all the business models switch toward how do we get recurring revenue, because you can't just cure some people and make money and then keep the money and save it and stay financially independent because you have enough money. The money is constantly losing value, so you have to constantly be finding new clients or getting return clients. And so this, it's kind of like dating apps. I saw this metaphor sometime on Twitter. Dating apps, they want it to be good enough for you to meet people, but they don't want it to be good enough for you to meet the person you actually spend the rest of your life with, because then you're no longer in the dating app. And it's the same thing with psychiatry and psychology. And I think the really pernicious thing about it is, especially with this idea of trauma, is people who go to psychology and psychiatry don't go there. Well, not always, obviously, and I'm not generalizing. I'm sure I'm sure everybody listening, your psychiatrist and your psychologist, I'm sure, is the exception. And obviously, don't listen to me. I'm crazy and I don't have any medical degrees. But I'm going to keep ranting anyway. The people who go to psychiatrists and psychologists, they don't go there to get over their trauma. They go there so that their trauma defines them. The trauma becomes their life. Exactly. It becomes, I am doing terrible things to myself because I was traumatized. And the answer is not for me to stop doing terrible things. The answer is for me to sit down on a couch and talk to somebody about how much I'm traumatized, so that I can justify to myself this horrific patterns of behavior. I've seen this with several people. And it's quite remarkable that it's liberating you from the agency of taking charge of your life. And you see it in very clear destructive behavior. And some of these people, they do drugs or they are alcoholics. And you tell them, okay, you're drinking too much. Maybe you had too much to drink. Maybe you should lay off the drinks for now. And they immediately, it's like conditioning. It's like, the Pavlovian dog. Immediately, once you mention the thing that they're doing that is destroying their life, which is alcohol or drugs, and you tell them, hey, maybe you should lay off this stuff. Maybe you've had enough drinks for today. This immediately they bring up the trauma. Like, you don't understand. You don't know what I'm going through. You don't know what I've been through.
My dad, my mom, yeah.
Exactly. And it's always, it's always, I've seen it as just very evil, because they go to those psychologists and psychiatrists and they're told, yes, here you go, you've got another 50 minutes, sit down and dwell on it, stew in it, rethink it, relive it, let it define you, let it define who you are, keep living it over and over and over and over again, and never break away from it, and keep letting the impact of it linger on. The trauma, the bad things that happen to you, let them continue to define you. You are what happened to you. And that's why you need to keep doing whatever it is that you're doing, and nobody should get the right to tell you. And you know, a big part of this, of course, is with psychology and psychiatry, is if there's any positive influence, anybody's trying to actually have a good influence on you and tell you, you know what, maybe you should just stop drinking instead of continuing to wallow in this. And drinking here is just a simple example. Usually the patterns of behavior that develop from this are more complex and destructive. Well, you know, I mean, drinking is pretty destructive. It can be. But in any case, if somebody's trying to break you out of this, you develop, the psychiatrist and the psychologist are likely to make you develop walls to defend yourself from this. No, this person's being toxic. You don't want to be, you don't need more pressure on you. You've already gone through the trauma, and that was horrible enough. You don't need people to push you to stop doing the destructive thing that you're doing. You need people to indulge you. Come and sit on my couch and be validated about all of your feelings and about all of the things that you're doing. And come and sit on my couch and take the pill. You know, lifetime subscription to pharma poison.
Yeah. It's I want to say that, like, you know, when you say the best thing here for people to do is to stop and not legitimize their issues and all this sort of stuff, and like, this ties back into the virtues again, is because what does it take to actually stop? Like, if you've got X problem and you're blaming it on your trauma, like, what it really takes to stop is one word or one virtue, which is courage. Like, it takes courage to rise above whatever it is your trauma, whatever it is the environment, whatever it is that happened to you, in order to fix your life. And that's Adler's focus. Like, you know, when people asked him, and it's in his books, he goes, the fundamental thing that people need to overcome their psychological problems, he boils it down to courage. That's it. You have to have the courage to go beyond what your perceived limitation is. And this is, I think, why, you know, it wasn't so much a conspiracy that Alfred Adler's work was ignored. I think maybe it's become a conspiracy, but his work fundamentally was uncomfortable. It's uncomfortable to be courageous. It's very comfortable to sit down and somebody tell you, look, it's not your fault. You know, it's this label, and it's this, you know, the thing that happened to you. It's your mom's fault. It's your dad's fault. It's your grandfather's fault. It's the workplace's fault. It's somebody else's fault. And in the process of doing that, like, I think much to what you said earlier about when we started the conversation about how the world has devolved, it's like, these things don't necessarily have to be some grand conspiracy where it's like, okay, we must not do this. They kind of happen to themselves when you have an environment, or, you know, there's certain like incentives, right? You want to follow the incentives where they go, and this is what happens. And I want to read something here from the book, which it says, you know, the whole point of Adler's school of psychology is that it's teleological, meaning that it is concerned with the present and the future, which are the things, surprisingly, that you can have control or influence over. Contrast this with essentially all other modern schools of psychology, which are etiological. In other words, they focus on past events and biological factors that impact psychology. That is, the things you have very little influence over. One is goal-oriented, the other is causation-oriented. And that right there kind of comes back to being an agent or being a victim, right? Like, modern psychology just literally, to make you feel better and to validate all of your issues, gives you a whole set of labels. And, you know, you then have, I have OCD, or I have anxiety, or I have depression, or I have this, I have that. You have a label and a reason for every single one of the problems in your life, when the solution to all of it is eat some steak, go to the gym, and get some sun, right? Like, is some courage. And we used to, like, men and women used to deal with this through, like, men went to work or went to war, right? Women used to raise families. And now we've got all this other shit in the way, with all of these layers of labeling and SSRIs and drugs and therapy and all this kind of crap, which obfuscates all of it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think one very dangerous aspect of this, which it's a very powerful point that I've come across. In modern society, everybody's got to have, the highest status that you can aspire to is victimhood.
Yes.
You
I
have
call
to
it
be
the
a
oppression
victim.
Olympics.
Yeah, the oppression Olympics. And so basically your status in society is determined by how many tags of oppression you've got.
Yes.
So being black, being brown, all that, these are all great points. Being a woman,
Disabled.
being gay. And, not everybody can be black or brown or a woman. So then you've got to be creative. And this has, I think, particularly in universities, and it's obviously it's big pharma marketing for their poison, but this is how you can get in on the Olympics, particularly if you don't fit into the other categories. If you're a white male, or even a white woman, because woman is not such a big deal anymore. You're not really very high on the oppression Olympics if you're a woman anymore. But if you have a depression, if you have a condition, and then you define yourself by that condition, people wear it like an identity instead of taking pride in their work and their achievement. It's, hey, I have this thing, and so therefore when you talk to me, you have to talk to me in a certain way, and you have to deal with me in a certain way. And again, this is just again, I keep drawing everything back to fiat. I don't think so much it's a conspiracy against Adler. It's just that Adler doesn't pay bills in a fiat world. In a fiat world, you need recurring revenue because nobody has savings. And so all the ideas that lead to recurring revenue work. If you actually did find a magic pill that cures cancer, you would not be able to market it. You'd need to pay so many billions of dollars to get it into the market, to be approved, to get FDA approval, and to get licensing and patents and all of those things. That costs several billions of dollars and takes a lot of time. And then if people will just take one pill and be cured, that's likely not going to be paying for you. So you need to make addictions. So the pills need to be for addiction. And so telling people, as Adler says, look, your trauma happened, but you're alive now and you're able to function as a normal human being physically, so you can just go out there and live your life. You can just live your life and not let the trauma define you. Just go to the gym, eat some meat, and get some sunshine for 3 months and see how it goes. If you do that, that's going to really destroy the business model of psychology and psychiatry. And so you gotta stew in your trauma, man. You have to sit there and just stew in it and let it define you and continue to let it define you. And I remember one of the reasons I respect Andrew Tate is because he was really brave about doing this. I thought this, and I generally not wanted to speak too much about it because I think it can be quite uncomfortable for people. But I'm just putting this out there right now. If you disagree with me, you know what? I don't care. Don't come ranting at me. Yes, I know a lot of people disagree. I don't care. I've heard a lot of people, you've spent all of your life being told that Freud and psychiatry and psychology are important. I think it's stupid pseudoscience. And don't shout at me if you don't agree. That's fine. There are other people out there who say the things that you like. Just go listen to them. This is my opinion. I think you're better off just eating meat, lifting, and getting sunshine. But I'm sure, your doctor and your psychologist and psychiatrist disagree for very good reasons. So whatever.
Yeah, look, the last thing I'll say on this is, depression is real insofar as it's a temporary state that acts as a signal. Your body's nervous system is telling you that you are not living in accordance with your ideals, your values, or you're living without meaning. That's it. And if you go and numb your body's signaling mechanism, you are going to everything up. And that's the biggest criminal sort of component about depression. This is why I've always hated this idea, is that sorry, I'm going to have to read another part of the book here. It says, for over 15 years, I've triggered my psychologist friends by calling depression act or behavior, not a syndrome or disease. You don't get depression, you do depression by choosing to remain in that state. It's not just something that happens to you or that you catch like the flu. It's a choice, or at most, it's a temporary feeling. Of course, life can knock you down, and instead of feeling elevated, you occasionally feel depressed. That's normal. It happens to all of us. And it's your body's way of telling you to take stock and introspect for a minute. This feeling is a healthy signal from the nervous system to adjust your behavior, or a warning that you are lacking focus or meaning in your life. Instead of using it as the catalyst for change or riding it like the wave of emotion that it is, modern psychology short circuits the natural process by teaching you to numb yourself into oblivion with drugs, or to marry the feeling and label yourself clinically depressed. Right. So that's like, this is a big point for me. And I want to just say something earlier. You said like recurring revenue and, is something that fiat incentivizes. And I guess I only agree 50% there. I think recurring revenue is always something that a business will optimize for. You want to increase your customer lifetime value, and it's always easier to get another purchase from an existing customer than it is to go and chase a new customer. I think in cases like this, when it comes to the criminality around, turning people into victims and telling them to wear 10,000 labels about their depression and everything like that, I think this is where ultimately teaching the virtue of responsibility comes into play. Like we can't, so this is an area where we have to. It's not just about fixing the money, but it's about fixing the virtues or fixing the culture, right? If you have a culture that values responsibility, or that holds responsibility up as a virtue that you like, do you think, for example, responsibility was huge amongst the Spartans? Do you think the Spartans had a psychologist there sitting there telling them about their depression, all this? No, that didn't happen, right? Like, or the samurai. Like, could you imagine the samurai as a warrior class worrying about like, I'm feeling a bit depressed today, and taking some pills? It did not work like that. So when you establish a culture which basically has a standard that, hey, we don't accept victimhood amongst our young man, or whatever that case is, like you have those standards, then you can basically ostracize in many ways, or not allow for the creation of these kind of corrupt businesses like Big Pharma that want to create a society in which everybody's a victim, because the more victims you have, the more customers you have. So this is where it sort of comes back to my whole theory and the whole reason I wrote this book. We need Bitcoin, but we need this code as well, that they both have to come hand in hand to build civilization. They're so important together.
Yeah, no, I definitely agree with that. And I think, as you said, the samurai weren't getting depressed. Anybody who's got meaning, a reason to get out of bed, is not being depressed. If you get out of bed excited because you want to do things today, then you are going to not have a problem with depression. I think this is just the nature of things. And as you said, your body is giving you a very valuable signal that what you're doing now is not working. It could be the relationships that you're in. It could be the work that you're doing. It could be something about whatever it is. There's something about your life that is eating you inside. And your body is signaling this. And if you go to the scammer psychiatrist and he just gives you a pill, but you continue to do your life the way that you're doing it, it's actually far worse than just being a poisonous addiction that's going to cost you a lot of money. It's a lot worse because it's allowing you to perpetuate and continue the behavior that is causing this. And it does that by numbing you, and it numbs you, and that makes you a very, very different person, which is why, I think, if you lift, if you eat meat, and if you get enough sunshine, I am pretty sure you can begin to fix the depression. Now, obviously, that's not enough, because if you're, say, miserable about the relationship that you're doing, or miserable about your work, or miserable about the day that you're spending your life, that you need to fix that. But the way to fix that is to get out there and become healthier, so that your brain starts working better. So get sunshine, eat meat, and exercise, work your body, healthy mind. You're going to look better. You're going to feel better. You're going to function better, think better. And all of that combined is going to allow you a lot more room for solving your problems. And you'll figure out a solution a lot better when you're high on steak and sun and steel, rather than if you're high on SSRIs and all of this pharma poison.
And porn.
And I'll just say this:
yeah.
you are a lot. I mean, just try 1 month of beef, of steak, sun, and steel, the 3 S's, before you switch to the SSRIs. Because you know what? It's very easy to quit steak, sun, and steel. So if it doesn't work, you try a month. Okay, you maybe I don't believe this is going to happen, but maybe it makes you feel a lot worse. Maybe the sun is not for you. Maybe beef is not for you. Maybe you really are so special that you are not like all the rest of us humans who can thrive on physical exercise and meat and sunshine. But guess what? If that happens, you can quit meat and sunshine and gym any day, and there are no bad withdrawal effects. But you sign up for your psychiatrist's bills, it's a lot more difficult to quit. So I very, very strongly urge you to maybe consider trying the first one first. But hey, this is not medical advice. I'm just crazy conspiracy theorist economist who's just ranting with my friend, and you chose to listen to this. So don't hold me responsible if you if you eat steak and it causes your depression to not go away, then don't sue me.
Our condolences.
You only act out of your own will. I'm just ranting here. You don't have to listen to me. None of this is medical advice.
I wanna tie this into one other section of the book called physiopsychology, which is a very Nietzschean idea. And while I was writing the book, I really went down the Nietzsche rabbit hole. And I think this is why I love this idea of like merging sort of Christianity, Hoppianism, and Nietzscheanism kind of together, like this Venn diagram as a framework for individuals and society. But before I go down there, I just wanted to say, I just came up with something as you were talking. So obviously we know the sun, steel, and steak. And I think that is the foundation that you need. And then if you want to keep going, you need purpose, progress, and power. Like that's the sort of the 3 next thing is you need to have something you're working towards. You need to be making progress. Like, I wrote about this the other day, talking about how freedom and happiness are effects of responsibility and progress, right? And we have optimized for society has optimized for the effects, not for the things that make them happen, right? So progress is the only way to get happiness. You cannot be happy if you're not making progress in some way, shape, or form. So you need purpose, you need progress, and the Nietzschean idea of you need to be expanding in some way, shape, or form your power. And power is a dirty word. Like people think, power is what corrupts and all this sort of shit. Total. Like power is just simply your capacity to channel energy. Power, like in the physics sense, is energy over time, right? There's nothing evil about that. And your goal as a human being is to enhance or to increase the amount of energy you can channel, at least till you get to your peak, and then in life, as you sort of get older or whatever the case is, if you can't channel physical power as much, you want to figure out how to channel the power through maybe your children or through the other things that you're doing. But fundamentally, like life is about channeling energy. So sun, steel, steak is your foundation. Purpose, progress, power is sort of like the direction you want to go. But
but I'll just say that definitely you need to seek those things. But I think sun, steel, and steak is how you're going to have the mental and physical clarity.
Exactly, it's the foundation. You can't do it without those. So you need the foundation, and then you need to. Then that's the direction. But you can't do that without fuel in the tank. But something I wanted to say about physiopsychology. So I talk a lot in the book about moving back to the body. And this is related here, is like sun, steel, steak is the solution to psychology. Sorry, it's the solution to depression because it strengthens your body. If you if you pretend like your body doesn't exist, like, this is what all the AI nerds and all this sort of stuff, like all the morons think is like somehow the mind is in the brain. Well, it's not. The mind exists within the body and the brain simultaneously. You can't have a brain in a vat. Like Yuval Harari is retarded if he thinks that we're going to live forever with a brain in a vat, right? It doesn't work like that. You need the body and the mind. They need to come together. And as you cultivate one, you cultivate the other. As you ignore one, you ignore the other, basically. And it it reminds me of this idea that philosophy, pre-Socratic ancient Greek philosophy, there was no concept of philosophy that was cerebral. It wasn't about talking about ideas. Philosophy was, I went and I sailed the Mediterranean during these storms, and I went and conquered an island, and I exerted my philosophy, my way of life, my understanding, and I came back with some lessons and I told a story. That was the original incarnation of what philosophy was. We've sort of like turned it into a cerebralization these days, pontificating about ideas and, arguing about like the definition. I had a debate with Breedlove the other day about like the semantics of the word freedom. And I was like, for fuck's sake, like this is just like painful. Like, I get that freedom is important to you, but for fuck's sake, like I don't need a philosophical treatise on like the ineffable, existence of freedom. Like I get it. So I think it's, one of the takeaways of the book here that I want to mention to people is that you cannot ignore the body. Like the idea of, brain detached from body is a Yuval Harari wet dream. It's a nerd's fallacy. Like you need both. You need to cultivate both. And true wisdom or true mastery, there's a section in the book or a whole chapter on mastery. Mastery is when the knowledge moves from the brain into the body, right? When you truly know that you know something, like this is the best football players, the best racing car drivers, the best athletes, the best thinkers, the best anything, have body intelligence where the knowledge or the capacity of it has moved into their reflexes. That's true mastery. That's true knowledge. And that's what requires the 10,000 hours of practice, right? You practice something to know it in your blood, in your DNA, not in your brain, which goes back to what we just discussed: sun, steel, stake, purpose. Like all of this stuff it's all interrelated. These principles apply across the whole spectrum.
Yeah. Well, you mentioned Nietzsche. I don't know if you've seen this. I've tweeted this out before. I really love this passage from Mises, which is basically him telling Nietzsche to even lift, bro. And it's it's really hilarious. I think it was one of the best dunks on Nietzsche. So I'm going to mention it. I mean, I mean, look, I agree with you on the importance of this, but I think a lot of these people can sort of take Nietzsche in a way that Mises critiques very well. So yes, it's true. You want there is a nobility to doing things with your body, and the idea that might is right, and that you want to be living dangerously. I mean, it sounds tempting, and it's very tempting for him to be saying it. But in reality, this notion of living as a violent person is not powerful at all, because the strongest man in the world, think about the most violent person. Think about John Jones or Francis Ngannou, the toughest UFC fighter. He'd probably kill 99.999% of men with his bare hands, maybe even more. He could kill them with his bare hands if you put him in a cage. Well, that guy, a 10-year-old girl can kill him if she is able to be part of human civilization, part of the division of labor, and he's not. So if you're John Jones, a 10-year-old, and you're just relying on the fact that you're powerful, so you don't need people, so you don't trade with people, you don't respect people's property, you think, well, I'm stronger than all of those people. Think if John Jones decides, I'm stronger than everybody, I'm just going to stop paying for anything, I'm just going to take all of my stuff that I want, because if anybody talks to me, I'm just going to punch them. Well, no matter how strong you are physically, you are inconsequential, an inconsequential fly, a mosquito, next to anybody who has access to the division of labor, because the division of labor allows us to build guns that can shoot you down. Whereas John Jones on his own, no matter how smart, no matter how strong, will never be able to build a gun on his own. Nobody can build a gun on his own. A gun requires an enormous division of labor. So yes, you want to get out there, you want to work out, you do want to lift, but you don't want to glorify violence and barbarism, because by your own measure, which is strength and power, this is not the way to be powerful. The way to be powerful is to join the division of labor, respect property rights, not violate people's rights, and understand that property rights are more important than might. And so right trumps might. If this is your land, it doesn't matter if I can punch you and take your land, because if I take your land and punch you, then your son or daughter can just get a gun and shoot me. And so that's why the strongest societies, the strongest people in the world, are all part of the division of labor. So Mises says to Nietzsche, "It is noteworthy that the men who were foremost in extolling the eminence of the savage impulses of our barbarian forefathers were so frail that their bodies would not have come up to the requirements of dangerous living. Nietzsche, even before his mental breakdown, was so sickly that the only climate he could stand was that of the Engadine Valley and of some Italian districts. He would not have been in a position to accomplish his work if civilized society had not protected his delicate nerves against the roughness of life. The apostles of violence wrote their books under the sheltering roof of bourgeois security, which they derided and disparaged. They were free to publish their incendiary sermons because the liberalism which they scorned safeguarded freedom of the press. They would have been desperate if they had had to forego the blessings of, They would have been desperate if they had had to forego the blessings of the civilization and of the civilization scorned by their philosophy. And what a spectacle was that! What a spectacle was that timid writer George Sorel, who went so far in his praise of brutality as to blame the modern system of education for weakening men's inborn tendencies towards violence." I just couldn't help. Every time I see this, I remember this.
Yeah, I mean, Nietzsche would hike 6 hours each day. He would wake up at 5 o'clock in the morning. He would have some fruit, and then he would hike for 6 hours in the mountains, and then he would go and write. There was nothing weak about that. I think a lot of people sort of have.
He should have been having steak and lifting, but okay.
I mean, whatever. I'm pretty sure he was eating steak as well. Like, this guy was in the army initially. He was like literally shot at and went to war with people. So like this sort of conception that Nietzsche was like a pussy and all this sort of stuff is incorrect. He may have become an incel, but people say then he got syphilis, and the only way to get syphilis is by someone. So that kind of contradiction breaks down as well. So like there's a lot of Nietzsche's
there is another way.
Maybe, but Nietzsche is an interesting character because everyone like on the left, on the right, in economics, everyone hates him, and he just like he triggers everybody, which is why I personally love him. But I just wanted to pull on the thing of barbarism, savagery, and then also what was mentioned at the end of that quote right there, which is people have been softened in modern civilization. We've been softened to the point where we ignore our impulses for, you can call it barbarism, savagery, or whatever, but like the impulse to actually get up and do something that exerts one is traded for comfort and safety. And there is a in my opinion, someone like Nietzsche wasn't arguing against, for example, the capacity to increase your power through economic means and private property. In fact, I think Nietzsche many times has warned against democracy and all of the stupidity that would occur if we start to, go down the non-economic path, right? So he's never really been a critic of that. What he was a critic of was the excessive liberalization and softening of civilization, which would lead to the weak men state. And when you get to weak men, you end up with bad times, because weak men are the ones that decide to print money. Weak men are the ones that decide to create a society in which cheating is glorified, right? So like if you think about strength, and I have this definition in the book, strength is not getting into a ring and beating up a little child, right? Like I'm not stronger because I kicked a 5-year-old in the face. I'm stronger if I get into the ring and exert myself or push myself, right? And channel my energy in some capacity. So strength is more about punching up than punching down. And that was, I think, the crux of Nietzsche's philosophy, is that he wasn't interested as much in the means, but more in the ends of if you're going to construct a civilization, you must have a relationship to power, strength, the savage impulse, in the sense not to just go and take somebody else's shit, but to be able to expand and to conquer, right? That was the sort of idea. It's like when Cortez sailed from Spain to, the Americas, like they had this will to power, fundamentally speaking, to go and change the universe or change the world through the prism that they saw as more correct. And their version of civilization brought us what we have today. Columbus the same, et cetera, et cetera. So I think there's, in my opinion, like the Hoppian ideal or the Misesian ideal actually matches more with Nietzsche than it doesn't. For me, if I had to pinpoint what Nietzsche's criticism was around excessive liberalization, which ties into what we discussed earlier. His critique was about, don't make men weak, and don't institute democracy where every lemming gets a vote, because then you will optimize society for average and it will devolve. If you want a strong society, you need to optimize for excellence. That was sort of Nietzsche's conceptualization of things. And then you need the economic framework for that. So in this case, sun, steel, and stake would be the equivalent of Mises, would be the foundation. You need that, because if you do not do that, I don't give a fuck how much purpose, progress, all sorts of stuff you're talking about. If you are eating seed oils and you're in the dark and you never lift anything, you're not going to achieve any of that. So you need the economic basis. So like Misesian Austrian thinking is that. But to transcend that, you need this sort of Nietzschean ideal of progress, power, and purpose. Like you need to push beyond what is just what makes sense on the spreadsheet. Right. So you need to have that vitality. Like you need to have the courage, the heart, the spirit of a Alexander or Napoleon, someone who wants to bend the universe. This is, the people who exhibit that today, in my opinion, are people like Steve Jobs or Jeff Bezos, right? Like they are able to take that energy and create something that nobody thought was possible. Imagine being laughed at, like Bezos, being laughed at for a decade about this idea that you could build this business that can produce that. Yes, I know there's arguments about, this was only possible in a fiat world, yada, yada, yada. But ultimately, like he used that and he bent civilization in such a way that he created something that was before thought impossible. And he impacted everything. So anyway, that's sort of like what I would go in and just say is like a defense of Nietzsche to Mises.
Yes. All right. Well, man, this has been really fascinating and very interesting discussion. I enjoyed this a lot. So tell us more about what you're up to these days, Alex, and where people can find you and find your work, other than the Safehouse.
That's where we can wrap it up. I mean, I've if people want to, I highly recommend everybody watch the 2-minute trailer. I made a trailer for the book, and they can see that on bushidoofbitcoin.com, and it'll blow your mind. I promise you. Like, it's the best trailer you'll ever see on a book. I have, since we last spoke, obviously we spoke about a year and a half ago, I was building Spirit of Satoshi at that time. So just as an update to everyone, we ended up open sourcing it. We couldn't figure out how to commercialize it. And, such is the realities of building stuff in the real world. Sometimes it just doesn't work. We built it. We ended up, I remember when I demoed it with you, it was still pretty crap. We ended up getting it very, very, very good. Like, we would ask it even random questions like, tell me about Joe Biden, and it would say he's a war criminal and blah blah blah. We're like, whoa, okay. It was funny, but we couldn't figure out how to commercialize it. Unfortunately, there wasn't a market for a Bitcoin only LLM. So we open sourced it. We put it on Hugging Face, so anybody can download it and use it there. And since then, I moved on to building a platform which is kind of like a Nostr app, but a different kind. So I've been passionate about like travel and this idea of the sovereign individual lifestyle, and health and geo arbitrage and building network states and being outside of the system for a long time. And we're trying to build something where it kind of combines the social element, events, merchants. So you can find anything where, like, you can find merchants that are seed oil free or Bitcoin only and stake, Carnival, like all this sort of stuff. It kind of combines all of these things in this kind of like new directory / social app. So it's very interesting. It's like I can't describe it in a single sentence because I guess similar to how Facebook, before Facebook, you couldn't really describe what Facebook was. This is kind of like that. It's a new category defining product. But that's where all my focus is. Bushido of Bitcoin, and that I'm writing a part 2 to the Bushido of Bitcoin called The Metaphysics of War and Beauty. And this is it's sort of like it extends on some of the ideas from the Bushido of Bitcoin. It kind of, it's kind of like the metaphysics behind the Bushido. So I'm working on that. And also the Bitcoin Times, I've actually handed off to Canute and Luke from the Freedom Footprint show. So they're going to be leading that from now on, because I'm trying to like simplify my life and just focus on 2 things: my professional life, Atlantis, and my private sort of writing life is Bushido. So there'll be a whole series of Bushido books, which I'm sure we'll end up publishing the whole series with you at some point.
Nice. Well, that's wonderful to hear, man. Thank you so much again. And yeah, keep churning out great books.
Thank you, my friend. Thank you for having me on, and thank you for the great conversation.
Oh, thanks. My pleasure. Take care.
You too.